Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Chapter 26 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 26 is titled The Secret of Primitive Accumulation, and it's the first of 8 chapters in Part 8 of 8 of Capital Volume 1. Part 8 is called Primitive Accumulation, and what this whole section deals with is how capitalism came to be. Basically, this chapter is kind of an introduction to this part, and to take a choice quote from this chapter, quote, "The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it," unquote. So basically, we're talking about how did capitalism come about? How did the previous mode of production, feudalism, break down in such a way that the capitalist order rose to take its place? Without further ado, let's begin Chapter 26, The Secret of Primitive Accumulation. We have seen how money is changed into capital, how through capital surplus value is made, and from surplus value, more capital. But the accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalistic production. Capitalistic production presupposes the pre-existence of considerable masses of capital and of labor power in the hands of producers of commodities. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn in a vicious circle, out of which we can only get by supposing a primitive accumulation, the previous accumulation of Adam Smith, preceding capitalistic accumulation. An accumulation not the result of the capitalistic mode of production, but its starting point. This primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times long gone by, there were 2 sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of the theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow, but the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority that, despite all its labor, has up to now nothing to sell but itself, and the wealth of the few that increases constantly although they have long ceased to work. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in the defense of property. Monsieur Thiers, for example, had the assurance to repeat it with all the solemnity of a statesman to the French people, once so spiritual. But as soon as the question of property crops up, it becomes a sacred duty to proclaim the intellectual food of the infant as the one thing fit for all ages and for all stages of development. In actual history, it is notorious that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly, force play the great part. In the tender annals of political economy, the idyllic reigns from time immemorial. Right and labor were from all time the sole means of enrichment, the present year, of course, always excepted. As a matter of fact, the methods of primitive accumulation are anything but idyllic. In themselves, money and commodities are no more capital than are the means of production and of subsistence. They want transforming into capital. But this transformation itself can only take place under certain circumstances that center in this, viz. That 2 very different kinds of commodity possessors must come face to face and into contact. On the one hand, the owners of money, means of production, means of subsistence, who are eager to increase the sum of values they possess by buying other people's labor power. On the other hand, free laborers, the sellers of their own labor power, and therefore the sellers of labor. Free laborers, in the double sense that neither they themselves form part and parcel of the means of production, as in the case of slaves, bondsmen, etc., nor do the means of production belong to them, as in the case of peasant proprietors. They are therefore free from, unencumbered by, any means of production of their own. With this polarization of the market for commodities, the fundamental conditions of capitalist production are given. The capitalist system presupposes the complete separation of the laborers from all property in the means by which they can realize their labor. As soon as capitalist production is once on its own legs, it not only maintains this separation, but reproduces it on a continually extending scale. The process, therefore, that clears the way for the capitalist system can be none other than the process which takes away from the laborer the possession of their means of production. A process that transforms, on the one hand, the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other, the immediate producers into wage laborers. The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it. The economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. The immediate producer, the laborer, could only dispose of their own person after they had ceased to be attached to the soil and ceased to be the slave, serf, or bondsman of another. To become a free seller of labor power, who carries their commodity wherever they find a market, they must further have escaped from the regime of the guilds, their rules for apprenticeships and journeymen, and the impediments of their labor regulations. Hence, the historical movement, which changes the producers into wage workers, appears on the one hand as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But, on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production, and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. The industrial capitalists, these new potentates, had on their part not only to displace the guild masters of handicrafts, but also the feudal lords, the possessors of the sources of wealth. In this respect, their conquest of social power appears as the fruit of a victorious struggle both against feudal lordship and its revolting prerogatives, and against the guilds and the fetters they laid on the free development of production and the free exploitation of man by man. The captains of industry, however, only succeeded in supplanting the captains of the sword by making use of events of which they themselves were wholly innocent. They have risen by means as vile as those by which the Roman freedman, once on a time, made himself the master of his patronus. The starting point of the development that gave rise to the wage laborer, as well as to the capitalist, was the servitude of the laborer. The advance consisted in a change of form of the servitude, in the transformation of feudal exploitation into capitalist exploitation. To understand its march, we need not go back very far. Although we come across the first beginnings of capitalist production, as early as the 14th or 15th century sporadically in certain towns of the Mediterranean, the capitalistic era dates from the 16th century. Wherever it appears, the abolition of serfdom has long been effected, and the highest development of the Middle Ages, the existence of sovereign towns, has long been on the wane. In the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch-making that act as levers for the capital class in the course of their formation, but above all, those moments when great masses of men are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled as free and, quote, unattached proletarians on the labor market. The expropriation of the agricultural producer, of the peasant, from the soil, is the basis of the whole process. The history of this expropriation in different countries assumes different aspects and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession and at different periods. In England alone, which we take as our example, has it the classic form. Footnote, in Italy, where capitalistic production developed earliest, the dissolution of serfdom also took place earlier than elsewhere. The serf was emancipated in that country before they had acquired any prescriptive right to the soil. Their emancipation at once transformed them into a free proletarian, who moreover found their master ready waiting for them in the towns, for the most part handed down as legacies from the Roman time. When the revolution of the world market, about the end of the 15th century, annihilated northern Italy's commercial supremacy, a movement in the reverse direction set in. The laborers of the towns were driven en masse into the country, and gave an impulse never before seen to the petite culture, carried on in the form of gardening. And that's the end of Chapter 26. Like I said, an introduction to Part 8 of 8. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. So thank you very much for that vital support on this listener-supported channel. We don't run ads on this channel, so if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online to a fair extent, but the organizing, the third part of that slogan, happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your offline political activity on organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the September 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Chapter 27 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 27 is titled Expropriation of the Agricultural Population from the Land, and it's the second chapter in Part 8 of 8, Primitive Accumulation, of Capital Volume 1. We were introduced to this topic of primitive accumulation, or the conditions which were necessary for capitalism to arise, in the last chapter, Chapter 26, and in this chapter we're going to go back into the deeper history of England, 14th and 15th century, feudal era, to look at how that society was constructed and how it was torn up to make way for capitalism. As Chapter 26 concluded, in the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch-making that act as levers for the capitalist class in their course of formation, but above all, those moments when great masses of men are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled as free and unattached proletarians on the labor market. The expropriation of the agricultural producer, of the peasant, from the soil is the basis of the whole process. The history of this expropriation in different countries assumes different aspects and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession and at different periods. In England alone, which we take as our example, has it the classic form. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at here in Chapter 27, the expropriation of the agricultural population from the land, specifically in the example of England. Let's begin. In England, serfdom had practically disappeared in the last part of the 14th century. The immense majority of the population consisted then, and to a still larger extent in the 15th century, of free peasant proprietors. And there's a footnote quoting Macaulay's History of England, 10th edition, 1854, Volume 1. The petty proprietors who cultivated their own fields with their own hands, and enjoyed a modest competence, then formed a much more important part of the nation than at present. If we may trust the best statistical writers of that age, not less than 160,000 proprietors who, with their families, must have made up more than a seventh of the whole population, derived their subsistence from little freehold estates. The average income of these small landlords was estimated at between £60 and £70 a year. It was computed that the number of persons who tilled their own land was greater than the number of those who farmed the land of others." Unquote. Even in the last third of the 17th century, 4/5 of the English people were agricultural. I quote Macaulay because as a systematic falsifier of history, he minimizes as much as possible facts of this kind. Back to the main text. In the larger seigneurial domains, the old bailiff, himself a serf, was displaced by the free farmer. The wage laborers of agriculture consisted partly of peasants who utilized their leisure time by working on the large estates, partly of an independent special class of wage laborers, relatively and absolutely few in numbers. The latter were also practically at the same time peasant farmers, since, besides their wages, they had allotted to them arable land to the extent of 4 or more acres together with their cottages. Besides, they, with the rest of the peasants, enjoyed the usufruct of the common land, which gave pasture to their cattle, furnished them with tinder, firewood, turf, etc. Footnote, we must never forget that even the serf was not only the owner, if but a tribute-paying owner, of the piece of land attached to his house, but also a co-possessor of the common land. Quote, "The peasant is a serf. It has not yet been possible to persuade the Silesians to partition the common lands, whereas in the Neumark there is scarcely a village where the partition has not been implemented with very great success." That's quoting Mirabeau's On the Prussian Monarchy, 1788. Back to the main text. In all countries of Europe, feudal production is characterized by division of the soil amongst the greatest possible number of subfeudatories. The might of the feudal lord, like that of the sovereign, depended not on the length of his rent roll, but on the number of his subjects, and the latter depended on the number of peasant proprietors. Footnote, Japan, with its purely feudal organization of landed property, and its developed petite culture, gives a much truer picture of the European Middle Ages than all our history books, dictated as these are, for the most part, by bourgeois prejudices. It is very convenient to be, quote, liberal at the expense of the Middle Ages. Back to the main text. Although, therefore, the English land after the Norman conquest was distributed in gigantic baronies, one of which often included some 900 of the old Anglo-Saxon lordships, it was bestrewn with small peasant properties, only here and there interspersed with great seigneurial domains. Such conditions, together with the prosperity of the towns, so characteristic of the 15th century, allowed of that wealth of the people which Chancellor Fortescue so eloquently paints in his Laudes Legum Angliae, but it excluded the possibility of capitalistic wealth. The prelude of the revolution that laid the foundation of the capitalist mode of production was played in the last third of the 15th and the first decade of the 16th century. A mass of free proletarians was hurled on the labor market by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers who, as Sir James Stewart well says, quote, everywhere uselessly filled house and castle, unquote. Although the royal power, itself a product of bourgeois development, in its strife after absolute sovereignty forcibly hastened on the dissolution of these bands of retainers, it was by no means the sole cause of it. In insolent conflict with king and parliament, the great feudal lords created an incomparably larger proletariat by the forcible driving of the peasantry from the land, to which the latter had the same feudal right as the lord himself, and by the usurpation of the common lands. The rapid rise of the Flemish wool manufactures and the corresponding rise in the price of wool in England gave the direct impulse to these evictions. The old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. The new nobility was the child of its time, for which money was the power of all powers. Transformation of arable land into sheepwalks was therefore its cry. Harrison, in his Description of England, prefixed to Holinshed's Chronicles, describes how the expropriation of small peasants is ruining the country. Quote, what care our great encroachers, unquote. The dwellings of the peasants and the cottages of the laborers were razed to the ground or doomed to decay. Quote, if, says Harrison, the old records of every manor be sought, it will soon appear that in some manor 17, 18, or 20 houses are shrunk, that England was never less furnished with people than at the present. Of cities and towns either utterly decayed or more than a quarter or half diminished, though some one be a little increased here or there, of towns pulled down for sheepwalks and no more but the lordships now standing in them, I could say somewhat, unquote. The complaints of these old chroniclers are always exaggerated, but they reflect faithfully the impression made on contemporaries by the Revolution in the conditions of production. A comparison of the writings of Chancellor Fortescue and Thomas More reveals the gulf between the 15th and 16th century. As Thornton rightly has it, the English working class was precipitated without any transition from its golden into its iron age. Legislation was terrified at this revolution. It did not yet stand on that height of civilization where the, quote, wealth of the nation, i.e., the formation of capital and the reckless exploitation and impoverishing of the mass of the people, figure as the ultima thule of all statecraft. In his History of Henry VII, Bacon says, quote, enclosures at that time, 1489, began to be more frequent, whereby arable land, which could not be manured without people and families, was turned into pasture, which was easily rid by a few herdsmen, and tenancies for years, lives, and at will, whereupon much of the yeomanry lived, were turned into domains. This bred a decay of people, and by consequence a decay of towns, churches, tithes, and the like. In remedying of this inconvenience, the king's wisdom was admirable, and the parliaments at that time. They took a course to take away depopulating enclosures and depopulating pasturage, unquote. An act of Henry VII, 1489, forbade the destruction of all, quote, houses of husbandry to which at least 20 acres of land belonged. By an act, 25 Henry VIII, the same law was renewed. It recites, among other things, that many farms and large flocks of cattle, especially of sheep, are concentrated in the hands of a few men, whereby the rent of land has much risen and tillage has fallen off. Churches and houses have been pulled down, and marvelous numbers of people have been deprived of the means wherewith to maintain themselves and their families. The act, therefore, ordains the rebuilding of the decayed farmsteads, and fixes a proportion between cornland and pasture land, etc. An act of 1533 recites that some owners possess 24,000 sheep, and limits the number to be owned to 2,000. Footnote, in his Utopia, Thomas More says that in England, quote, your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame, and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, be become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves, unquote. Back to the main text. The cry of the people and the legislation directed for 150 years after Henry VII against the expropriation of the small farmers and peasants were alike fruitless. The secret of their inefficiency Bacon, without knowing it, reveals to us, quote, "The device of King Henry VII, says Bacon in his Essays Civil and Moral, Essay 29, was profound and admirable, in making farms and houses of husbandry of a standard, that is, maintained with such a proportion of land unto them as may breed a subject to live in convenient plenty and no servile condition, and to keep the plough in the hands of the owners and not mere hirelings," unquote. And there's a footnote. Bacon shows the connection between a free, well-to-do peasantry and good infantry. Quote, "This did wonderfully concern the might and mannerhood of the kingdom, to have farms as it were of a standard sufficient to maintain an able body out of penury, and did in effect amortize a great part of the lands of the kingdom unto the hold and occupation of the yeomanry or middle people, of a condition between gentlemen and cottagers and peasants. For it hath been held by the general opinion of men of best judgment in the wars, that the principal strength of an army consisteth in the infantry or foot, and to make good infantry it requireth men bred not in a servile or indigent fashion, but in some free and plentiful manner. Therefore, if a state run most to noblemen and gentlemen, and that the husbandmen and ploughmen be but as their workfolk and labourers, or else mere cottagers, which are but housed beggars, you may have a good cavalry, but never good stable bands of foot. And this is to be seen in France and Italy and some other parts abroad, where in effect all is noblesse or peasantry, insomuch that they are enforced to employ mercenary bands of Switzers and the like for their battalions of foot, whereby also it comes to pass that those nations have much people and few soldiers," unquote. That's from The Reign of Henry VII, verbatim reprint from Kennett's England, 1719, London, 1870. Back to the main text. What the capitalist system demanded was, on the other hand, a degraded and almost servile condition of the mass of the people, the transformation of them into mercenaries and of their means of labor into capital. During this transformation period, legislation also strove to retain the 4 acres of land by the cottage of the agricultural wage laborer, and forbade him to take lodgers into his cottage. In the reign of James I, 1627, Roger Crocker of Front Mill was condemned for having built a cottage on the manor of Front Mill without 4 acres of land attached to the same in perpetuity. As late as Charles I's reign, 1638, a royal commission was appointed to enforce the carrying out of the old laws, especially that referring to the 4 acres of land. Even in Cromwell's time, the building of a house within 4 miles of London was forbidden unless it was endowed with 4 acres of land. As late as the first half of the 18th century, complaint is made if the cottage of the agricultural laborer has not an adjunct of 1 or 2 acres of land. Nowadays he is lucky if it is furnished with a little garden, or if he may rent, far away from his cottage, a few roods. Quote, "Landlords and farmers, says Dr. Hunter, work here hand in hand. A few acres to the cottage would make the laborers too independent," unquote. And there's a footnote quoting George Roberts' The Social History of the People of the Southern Counties of England in Past Centuries, 1856. The quantity of land assigned in the old laws would now be judged too great for laborers, and rather as likely to convert them into small farmers, unquote. Back to the main text. The process of forcible expropriation of the people received in the 16th century a new and frightful impulse from the Reformation, and from the consequent colossal spoliation of the church property. The Catholic Church was, at the time of the Reformation, feudal proprietor of a great part of the English land. The suppression of the monasteries, etc., hurled their inmates into the proletariat. The estates of the church were to a large extent given away to rapacious royal favorites, or sold at a nominal price to speculating farmers and citizens, who drove out en masse their hereditary subtenants and threw their holdings into one. The legally guaranteed property of the poorer folk and a part of the church's tithes was tacitly confiscated. Footnote quoting Tuckett, "The right of the poor to share in the tithe is established by the tenor of ancient statutes," unquote. Back to the main text. "The poor are everywhere," cried Queen Elizabeth after a journey through England. In the 43rd year of her reign, the nation was obliged to recognize pauperism officially by the introduction of a poor rate. Quoting William Cobbett's History of the Protestant Reformation, the authors of this law seem to have been ashamed to state the grounds of it, for, contrary to traditional usage, it has no preamble whatever, unquote. By the 16th of Charles I, Chapter 4, it was declared perpetual, and in fact only in 1834 did it take a new and harsher form. Footnote, the spirit of Protestantism may be seen from the following, among other things. In the south of England, certain landed proprietors and well-to-do farmers put their heads together and propounded 10 questions as to the right interpretation of the Poor Law of Elizabeth. These they laid before a celebrated jurist of that time, Sergeant Snigg, later a judge under James I, for his opinion. Quote, Question 9. Some of the more wealthy farmers in the parish have devised a skillful mode by which all the trouble of executing this act, the 43rd of Elizabeth, might be avoided. They've proposed that we shall erect a prison in the parish and then give notice to the neighborhood that if any persons are disposed to farm the poor of this parish, they do give in sealed proposals on a certain day of the lowest price at which they will take them off our hands, and that they will be authorized to refuse to anyone unless he be shut up in the aforesaid prison. The proposers of this plan conceive that there will be found in the adjoining counties persons who, being unwilling to labor, and not possessing substance or credit to take a farm or ship, so as to live without labor, may be induced to make a very advantageous offer to the parish. If any of the poor perish under the contractor's care, the sin will lie at his door, as the parish will have done its duty by them. We are, however, apprehensive that the present Act, 43rd of Elizabeth, will not warrant a prudential measure of this kind, but you are to learn that the rest of the freeholders of the county, and of the adjoining county of B, will very readily join in instructing their members to propose an act to enable the parish to contract with a person to lock up and work the poor, and to declare that if any person shall refuse to be so locked up and worked, he shall be entitled to no relief. This, it is hoped, will prevent persons in distress from wanting relief. Genius, and be the means of keeping down parishes, unquote. That's from R. Blakely's The History of Political Literature from the Earliest Times, London, 1855, Volume 2. In Scotland, the abolition of serfdom took place some centuries later than in England. Even in 1698, Fletcher of Salton declared in the Scotch Parliament, quote, "The number of beggars in Scotland is reckoned at not less than 200,000. The only remedy that I, a Republican on principle, can suggest is to restore the old state of serfdom, to make slaves of all those who are unable to provide for their own subsistence," unquote. Comment, see California Politics in 2025. Continuing. Eden, Book 1, says, quote, "The decrease of villanage seems necessarily to have been the era of the origin of the poor. Manufactures and commerce are the two parents of our national poor," unquote. Eden, like our Scotch Republican on principle, errs only in this, not the abolition of villanage, but the abolition of the property of the agricultural laborer in the soil made him a proletarian, and eventually a pauper. In France, where the expropriation was effected in another way, the Ordinance of Moulins, 1571, and the Edict of 1656 correspond to the English Poor Laws. Back to the main text. These immediate results of the Reformation were not its most lasting ones. The property of the Church formed the religious bulwark of the traditional conditions of landed property. With its fall, these were no longer tenable. Footnote, Professor Rogers, although formerly Professor of Political Economy in the University of Oxford, the hotbed of Protestant orthodoxy, in his preface to the History of Agriculture lays stress on the fact of the pauperization of the mass of the people by the Reformation. Back to the main text. Even in the last decade of the 17th century, the yeomanry, the class of independent peasants, were more numerous than the class of farmers. They had formed the backbone of Cromwell's strength, and even according to the confession of Macaulay, stood in favorable contrast to the drunken squires and to their servants, the country clergy, who had to marry their masters' cast-off mistresses. About 1750, the yeomanry had disappeared, and so had, in the last decade of the 18th century, the last trace of the common land of the agricultural laborer. Footnote regarding the disappearance of the yeomanry, that's from a letter to Sir T.C. Bunbury on the high price of provisions by a Suffolk gentleman, Ipswich, 1795. Even the fanatical advocate of the system of large farms, the author of the Inquiry into the Connection between the Present Price of Provisions, London, 1773, says, quote, "I most lament the loss of our yeomanry, that set of men who really kept up the independence of this nation, and sorry I am to see their lands now in the hands of monopolizing lords, tenanted out to small farmers, who hold their leases on such conditions as to be little better than vassals, ready to attend a summons on every mischievous occasion," unquote. Back to the main text. We leave on one side here the purely economic causes of the agricultural revolution. We deal only with the forcible means employed. After the restoration of the Stuarts, the landed proprietors carried, by legal means, an act of usurpation, effected everywhere on the continent without any legal formality. They abolished the feudal tenure of land, i.e., they got rid of all its obligations to the state, quote-unquote, indemnified the state by taxes on the peasantry and the rest of the mass of the people, vindicated for themselves the rights of modern private property in estates to which they had only a feudal title, and finally passed those laws of settlement which, all the necessary changes having been made, had the same effect on the English agricultural laborer as the edict of the Tartar Boris Godunov on the Russian peasantry. The quote-unquote glorious revolution brought into power, along with William of Orange, the landlord and capitalist appropriators of surplus value. Footnote, on the private moral character of this bourgeois hero, among other things, quote, the large grant of lands in Ireland to Lady Orkney in 1695 is a public instance of the king's affection and the lady's influence. Lady Orkney's endearing offices are supposed to have been the foul ministry of lips, unquote. That's from the Sloane Manuscript Collection at the British Museum, number 4224. The manuscript is entitled The Character and Behavior of King William, Sunderland, etc., as represented in original letters to the Duke of Shrewsbury from Somers, Halifax, Oxford, Secretary Vernon, etc. It is full of curiosa. Back to the main text. They inaugurated the new era by practicing on a colossal scale thefts of state lands, thefts that had been hitherto managed more modestly. These estates were given away, sold at a ridiculous figure, or even annexed to private estates by direct seizure. Footnote quoting F.W. Newman's Lectures on Political Economy, 1851, the illegal alienation of the Crown estates, partly by sale and partly by gift, is a scandalous chapter in English history, a gigantic fraud on the nation, unquote. Engels adds, for details as to how the present large landed proprietors of England came into their possession, see our Old Nobility by Noblesse Obligée. London, 1879. Back to the main text. All this happened without the slightest observation of legal etiquette. The crown lands thus fraudulently appropriated, together with the robbery of the church estates as far as these had not been lost again during the Republican Revolution, form the basis of the today princely domains of the English oligarchy. Footnote, read for example E. Burke's pamphlet on the Ducal House of Bedford, whose offshoot was Lord John Russell, the quote-unquote Tom Tit of liberalism. Back to the main text. The bourgeois capitalists favored the operation with the view, among others, to promoting free trade in land, to extending the domain of modern agriculture on the large farm system, and to increasing their supply of the free agricultural proletarians ready to hand. Besides, the new landed aristocracy was the natural ally of the new bankocracy, of the newly hatched high finance, and of the large manufacturers, then depending on protective duties. The English bourgeoisie acted for its own interest quite as wisely as did the Swedish bourgeoisie who, reversing the process, hand in hand with their economic allies the peasantry, helped the kings in the forcible resumption of the crown lands from the oligarchy. This happened since 1604 under Charles X and Charles XI. Communal property, always distinct from state property just dealt with, was an old Teutonic institution which lived on under cover of feudalism. We have seen how the forcible usurpation of this, generally accompanied by the turning of arable into pasture land, begins at the end of the 15th and extends into the 16th century. But at that time, the process was carried on by means of individual acts of violence, against which legislation for 150 years fought in vain. The advance made by the 18th century shows itself in this, that the law itself becomes now the instrument of the theft of the people's land, although the large farmers make use of their little independent methods as well. Footnote quoting A Political Inquiry into the Consequences of Enclosing Wastelands, London, 1785. The farmers forbid cottagers to keep any living creatures besides themselves and children, under the pretense that if they keep any beasts or poultry, they will steal from the farmers' barns for their support. They also say, keep the cottagers poor, and you will keep them industrious, etc. But the real fact, I believe, is that the farmers may have the whole right of common to themselves. Unquote. Back to the main text. The parliamentary form of the robbery is that of acts for enclosure of commons. In other words, decrees by which the landlords grant themselves the people's land as private property, decrees of expropriation of the people. Sir F. M. Eden refutes his own crafty special pleading in which he tries to represent communal property as the private property of the great landlords who have taken the place of the feudal lords, when he himself demands a general act of parliament for the enclosure of commons, admitting thereby that a parliamentary coup d'etat is necessary for its transformation into private property, and moreover calls on the legislature for the indemnification for the expropriated poor. Whilst the place of the independent yeoman was taken by tenants at will, small farmers on yearly leases, a servile rabble dependent on the pleasure of the landlords, the systematic robbery of the communal lands helped especially, next to the theft of the state domains, to swell those large farms that were called in the 18th century capital farms or merchant farms, and to, quote, set free the agricultural population as proletarians for manufacturing industry. 2 footnotes there on capital farms, see 2 letters on the flour trade and the dearness of corn, by a Person in Business, 1767, and Merchant Farms, and An Enquiry into the Causes of the Present High Price of Provisions, 1767. Marx adds, this excellent work that was published anonymously is by the Reverend Nathaniel Forster. Back to the main text. The 18th century, however, did not yet recognize as fully as the 19th the identity between national wealth and the poverty of the people. Hence the most vigorous polemic in the economic literature of that time on the enclosure of commons. From the mass of materials that lie before me, I give a few extracts that will throw a strong light on the circumstances of the time. Quote, in several parishes of Hertfordshire, writes one indignant person, 24 farms, numbering on the average 50 to 150 acres, have been melted up into 3 farms. That's from Thomas Wright's Short Address to the Public on the Monopoly of Large Farms, 1779. Quote, in Northamptonshire and Leicestershire, the enclosure of common lands has taken place on a very large scale, and most of the new lordships resulting from the enclosure have been turned into pasturage, in consequence of which many lordships have not now 50 acres plowed yearly, in which 1,500 were plowed formerly. The ruins of former dwelling houses, barns, stables, etc., unquote, are the sole traces of the former inhabitants. Quote, 100 houses and families have, in some open field villages, dwindled to 8 or 10. The landholders in most parishes that have been enclosed only 15 or 20 years are very few in comparison of the numbers who occupied them in their open field state. It is no uncommon thing for 4 or 5 wealthy graziers to engross a large enclosed lordship which was before in the hands of 20 or 30 farmers, and as many smaller tenants and proprietors. All these are hereby thrown out of their livings with their families and many other families who were chiefly employed and supported by them. That's quoting Reverend Addington's Inquiry into the Reasons for or Against Enclosing Open Fields, 1772. It was not only the land that lay waste, but often land cultivated either in common or held under a definite rent paid to the community that was annexed by the neighboring landlords under pretext of enclosure. Quote, I have here in view enclosures of open fields and lands already improved. It is acknowledged by even the writers in defense of enclosures that these diminished villages increase the monopolies of farms, raise the prices of provisions, and produce depopulation, and even the enclosure of wastelands, as now carried on, bears hard on the poor, by depriving them of a part of their subsistence, and only goes toward increasing farms already too large. That's quoting Dr. R. Price, and Marx adds Forster, Addington, Kent, Price, and James Anderson should be read and compared with the miserable prattle of sycophant McCullough in his catalogue The Literature of Political Economy, 1845. Back to the main text. Quote, when, says Dr. Price, this land gets into the hands of a few great farmers, the consequence must be that the little farmers, and Marx adds earlier designated by him, quote, a multitude of little proprietors and tenants, who maintain themselves and families by the produce of the ground they occupy, by sheep kept on a common, by poultry, hogs, etc., and who therefore have little occasion to purchase any of the means of subsistence, back to the quote, will be converted into a body of men who earn their subsistence by working for others, and who will be under a necessity of going to market for all they want. There will perhaps be more labor because there will be more compulsion to it. Towns and manufactures will increase because more will be driven to them in quest of places and employment. This is the way in which the engrossing of farms naturally operates, and this is the way in which, for many years, it has been actually operating in this kingdom, unquote. He sums up the effect of the enclosures thus, quote, upon the whole, the circumstances of the lower ranks of men are altered in almost every respect for the worse. From little occupiers of land, they are reduced to the state of day laborers and hirelings, and at the same time, their subsistence in that state has become more difficult. Footnote, we are reminded of ancient Rome. Quote, the rich had got possession of the greater part of the undivided land. They trusted in the conditions of the time, that these possessions would not again be taken from them, and bought therefore some of the pieces of land lying near theirs, and belonging to the poor, with the acquiescence of their owners, and took some by force, so that now they were cultivating widely extended domains instead of isolated fields. Then they employed slaves in agriculture and cattle breeding, because freemen would have been taken from labor for military service. The possession of slaves brought them great gain, inasmuch as these, on account of their immunity from military service, could freely multiply and have a multitude of children. Thus the powerful men drew all wealth to themselves, and all the land swarmed with slaves. The Italians, on the other hand, were always decreasing in number, destroyed as they were by poverty, taxes, and military service. Even when times of peace came, they were doomed to complete inactivity, because the rich were in possession of the soil and used slaves instead of freemen in the tilling of it, unquote. That's from Appian's Civil Wars. This passage refers to the time before the Licinian rogations. Military service, which hastened to so great an extent the ruin of the Roman plebeians, was also the chief means by which, as in a forcing house, Charlemagne brought about the transformation of free German peasants into serfs and bondsmen. Back to the main text. In fact, usurpation of the common lands and the revolution in agriculture accompanying this told so acutely on the agricultural laborers that, even according to Eden, between 1765 and 1780, their wages began to fall below the minimum and to be supplemented by official poor law relief. Their wages, he says, quote, were not more than enough for the absolute necessaries of life, unquote. Let us hear for a moment a defender of enclosures and an opponent of Dr. Price, quote, "Not is it a consequence that there must be depopulation, because men are not seen wasting their labor in the open field, if by converting the little farmers into a body of men who must work for others more labor is produced, it is an advantage which the nation," Marx adds, to which of course the converted ones do not belong, quote, "should wish for the produce being greater when their joint labors are employed on one farm, there will be a surplus for manufactures, and by this means manufactures, one of the minds of the nation, will increase in proportion to the quantity of corn produced." That's quoting an inquiry into the connection between the present price of provisions, etc. In a footnote, Marx adds, to the like effect, but with an opposite tendency, quoting The Perils of the Nation, 2nd edition, 1843, working men are driven from their cottages and forced into the towns to seek for employment, but then a larger surplus is obtained, and thus capital is augmented, unquote. Back to the main text. The stoical peace of mind with which the political economist regards the most shameless violation of the, quote, sacred rights of property and the grossest acts of violence to persons, as soon as they are necessary to lay the foundations of the capitalistic mode of production, is shown by Sir F.M. Eden, philanthropist and Tory to boot. The whole series of thefts, outrages, and popular misery that accompanied the forcible expropriation of the people from the last third of the 15th to the end of the 18th century led him merely to the comfortable conclusion, quote, "the due proportion between arable land and pasture had to be established. During the whole of the 14th and the greater part of the 15th century, there was 1 acre of pasture to 2, 3, and even 4 of arable land. About the middle of the 16th century, the proportion was changed to 2 acres of pasture to 2. Later on, of 2 acres of pasture to 1 of arable, until at last the just proportion, if you say so, of 3 acres of pasture to 1 of arable land was attained," unquote. In the 19th century, the very memory of the connection between the agricultural laborer and the communal property had of course vanished. To say nothing of more recent times, have the agricultural population received a farthing of compensation for the 3.5 million acres of common land which between 1801 and 1831 were stolen from them, and by parliamentary devices presented to the landlords by the landlords. The last process of wholesale expropriation of the agricultural population from the soil is finally the so-called clearing of estates, i.e., the sweeping men off them. All the English methods hitherto considered culminated in clearing. As we saw in the picture of modern conditions given in a former chapter, where there are no more independent peasants to get rid of, the clearing of cottages begins, so that the agricultural laborers do not find on the soil cultivated by them even the spot necessary for their own housing. But what clearing of estates really and properly signifies, we learn only in the promised land of modern romance, the Highlands of Scotland. There the process is distinguished by its systematic character, by the magnitude of the scale on which it is carried out at one blow. In Ireland, landlords have gone to the length of sweeping away several villages at once. In Scotland, areas as large as German principalities are dealt with. Finally, by the peculiar form of property under which the embezzled lands were held. The Highland Celts were organized in clans, each of which was the owner of the land on which it was settled. The representative of the clan, its chief or great man, was only the titular owner of this property, just as the Queen of England is the titular owner of all the national soil. When the English government succeeded in suppressing the intestine wars of these great men, and their constant incursions into the lowland plains, the chiefs of the clans by no means gave up their time-honored trade as robbers, they only changed its form. On their own authority, they transformed their nominal right into a right of private property, and as this brought them into collision with their clansmen, resolved to drive them out by open force. Quote, "A king of England might as well claim to drive his subjects into the sea," unquote, says Professor Newman. This revolution, which began in Scotland after the last rising of the followers of the Pretender, that would be the Pope, can be followed through its first phases in the writings of Sir James Stewart and James Anderson. 2 footnotes there. Stewart says, quote, "If you compare the rent of these lands," Marx adds he erroneously includes in this economic category the tribute of the taskman to the clan chief, quote, "With the extent, it appears very small. If you compare it with the numbers fed upon the farm, you will find that an estate in the highlands maintains perhaps 10 times as many people as another of the same value in a good and fertile province," unquote. And for more from James Anderson, see Observations on the Means of Exciting a Spirit of National Industry, etc., 1777. Back to the main text. In the 18th century, the hunted-out Gaels were forbidden to emigrate from the country, with a view to driving them by force to Glasgow and other manufacturing towns. Footnote, in 1860, the people expropriated by force were exported to Canada under false pretenses. Some fled to the mountains and neighboring islands. They were followed by the police, came to blows with them, and escaped. Back to the main text. As an example of the method obtaining in the 19th century, the clearing made by the Duchess of Sutherland will suffice here. Footnote, in the Highlands of Scotland, says Buchanan, the commentator on Adam Smith, 1814, quote, "The ancient state of property is daily subverted. The landlord, without regard to the hereditary tenant, a category used in error here, now offers his land to the highest bidder, who, if he is an improver, instantly adopts a new system of cultivation. The land, formerly overspread with small tenants or laborers, was peopled in proportion to its produce, but under the new system of improved cultivation and increased rents, the largest possible produce is obtained at the least possible expense, and the useless hands being, with this view, removed, the population is reduced, not to what the land will maintain, but to what it will employ." Quoting David Buchanan's Observations on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1814, the dispossessed tenants either seek a subsistence in the neighboring towns, etc. And quoting George Ensor's An Inquiry Concerning the Population of Nations, 1818, the Scotch grandees dispossessed families as they would grub up coppice wood, and they treated villages and their people as Indians harassed with wild beasts do, in their vengeance, a jungle with tigers. Man is bartered for a fleece or a carcass of mutton, nay, held cheaper. Why, how much worse is it than the intention of the Mongols, who, when they had broken into the northern provinces of China, proposed in council to exterminate the inhabitants and convert the land into pasture. This proposal many Highland proprietors have effected in their own country against their own countrymen. Back to the main text. This person, well instructed in economy, resolved, on entering upon her government, to effect a radical cure, and to turn the whole country, whose population had already been, by earlier processes of the like kind, reduced to 15,000, into a sheepwalk. From 1814 to 1820, these 15,000 inhabitants, about 3,000 families, were systematically hunted and rooted out. All their villages were destroyed and burned, all their fields turned into pasturage. British soldiers enforced this eviction and came to blows with the inhabitants. One old woman was burnt to death in the flames of the hut, which she refused to leave. Thus this fine lady, Duchess of Sutherland, appropriated 794,000 acres of land that had from time immemorial belonged to the clan. She assigned to the expelled inhabitants about 6,000 acres on the seashore, 2 acres per family. The 6,000 acres had, until this time, lain waste and brought in no income to their owners. The Duchess, in the nobility of her heart, actually went so far as to let these at an average rent of 2 shillings 6 pence per acre to the clansmen, who for centuries had shed their blood for her family. The whole of the stolen clan land she divided into 29 great sheep farms, each inhabited by a single family, for the most part imported English farm servants. In the year 1835, the 15,000 Gaels were already replaced by 131,000 sheep. The remnant of the aborigines flung on the seashore tried to live by catching fish. They became amphibious and lived, as an English author says, half on land and half on water, and withal only half on both. Footnote, when the present Duchess of Sutherland entertained Mrs. Beecher Stowe, authoress of Uncle Tom's Cabin, with great magnificence in London, to show her sympathy for the Negro slaves of the American Republic, a sympathy that she prudently forgot with her fellow aristocrats during the Civil War, in which every noble English heart beat for the slave owner, I gave in the New York Tribune the facts about the Sutherland slaves, epitomized in part by Carey in The Slave Trade, Philadelphia, 1853. My article was reprinted in a Scotch newspaper and led to a pretty polemic between the latter and the sycophants of the Sutherlands. Back to the main text. But the brave Gaels must expiate yet more bitterly their idolatry, romantic and of the mountains, for the great men of the clan. The smell of their fish rose to the noses of the great men. They scented some profit in it, and let the seashore to the great fishmongers of London. For the second time the Gaels were hunted out. Footnote, interesting details on this fish trade will be found in Mr. David Urquhart's Portfolio New Series. Nassau W. Sr., in his posthumous work already quoted, terms, quote, the proceedings in Sutherlandshire one of the most beneficent clearings since the memory of man, unquote. Back to the main text. But finally, part of the sheepwalks are turned into deer preserves. Everyone knows that there are no real forests in England. The deer in the parks of the great are demurely domestic cattle, fat as London aldermen. Scotland is therefore the last refuge of the, quote, noble passion. Quote, in the Highlands, says Somers in 1848, new forests are springing up like mushrooms. Here, on one side of Guyk, you have the new forest of Glenfeshie, and there on the other, you have the new forest of Ardvariki. In the same line, you have the Black Mount, an immense waste also recently erected. From east to west, from the neighborhood of Aberdeen to the crags of Oban, you have now a continuous line of forests, while in other parts of the Highlands there are the new forests of Loch Arkaig, Glengarry, Glenmoriston, etc. Sheep were introduced into glens which had been the seats of communities of small farmers, and the latter were driven to seek subsistence on coarser and more sterile tracts of soil. Now deer are supplanting sheep, and these are once more dispossessing the small tenants who will necessarily be driven down upon still coarser land and to more grinding penury. Deer forests and the people cannot coexist. Footnote, the deer forests of Scotland contain not a single tree. The sheep are driven from, and then the deer driven to, the naked hills, and then it is called a deer forest. Not even timber planting and real forest culture. Back to the main text. One or other of the two must yield. Let the forests be increased in number and extent during the next quarter of a century, as they have been in the last, and the Gaels will perish from their native soil. This movement among the Highland proprietors is with some a matter of ambition, with some love of sport, while others of a more practical cast follow the trade in deer with an eye solely to profit. For it is a fact that a mountain range laid out in forest is in many cases more profitable to the proprietor than when let as a sheepwalk. The huntsman who wants a deer forest limits his offers by no other calculation than the extent of his purse. Sufferings have been inflicted in the Highlands scarcely less severe than those occasioned by the policy of the Norman kings. Deer have received extended ranges, while men have been hunted within a narrower and still narrower circle. One after one, the liberties of the people have been cloven down, and the oppressions are daily on the increase. The clearance and dispersion of the people is pursued by the proprietors as a settled principle, as an agricultural necessity, just as trees and brushwood are cleared from the wastes of America or Australia, and the operation goes on in a quiet, business-like way, etc. That's quoting from Robert Somers' Letters from the Highlands, or the Famine of 1847. These letters originally appeared in the Times. The English economists, of course, explained the famine of the Gaels in 1847 by their overpopulation. At all events, they were, quote, pressing on their food supply, unquote. The clearing of estates, or as it's called in Germany, Bauernlegen, occurred in Germany especially after the 30 Years' War, and led to peasant revolts as late as 1790 in Kursachsen. It obtained especially in East Germany. In most of the Prussian provinces, Frederick II, for the first time, secured right of property for the peasants. After the conquest of Silesia, he forced the landlords to rebuild the huts, barns, etc., and to provide the peasants with cattle and implements. He wanted soldiers for his army and taxpayers for his treasury. For the rest, the pleasant life that the peasant led under Frederick's system of finance and hodgepodge rule of despotism, bureaucracy, and feudalism may be seen from the following quotation from his admirer, Mirabeau, quote, "Flax represents one of the greatest sources of wealth for the peasant of North Germany. Unfortunately for the human race, this is only a resource against misery, and not a means toward well-being. Direct taxes, forced labor service, obligations of all kinds crush the German peasant, especially as he still has to pay indirect taxes on everything he buys. And to complete his ruin, he dare not sell his produce where and as he wishes. He dare not buy what he needs from the merchants, who could sell it to him at a cheaper price. He is slowly ruined by all those factors, and when the direct taxes fall due, he would find himself incapable of paying them without his spinning wheel. It offers him a last resort, while providing useful occupation for his wife, his children, his maids, his farmhands, and himself. But what a painful life he leads, even with this extra resource. In summer, he works like a convict with the plow and at harvest. He goes to bed at 9 o'clock and rises at 2 to get through all his work. In winter, he ought to be recovering his strength by sleeping longer, but he would run short of corn for his bread and next year's sowing if he got rid of the products that he needs to sell in order to pay the taxes. He therefore has to spin to fill up this gap, and indeed he must do so most assiduously. Thus the peasant goes to bed at midnight or 1 o'clock in winter and gets up at 5 or 6, or he goes to bed at 9 and gets up at 2, and this he does every day of his life except Sundays. These excessively short hours of sleep and long hours of work consume a person's strength, and hence it happens that men and women age much more in the country than in the towns," unquote. And there's a note to the second edition. In April 1866, 18 years after the publication of the work of Robert Summers quoted above, Professor Leone Levi gave a lecture before the Society of Arts on the transformation of sheep walks into deer forest, in which he depicts the advance in the devastation of the Scottish Highlands. He says, with other things, quote, depopulation and transformation into sheep walks were the most convenient means for getting an income without expenditure. A deer forest in place of a sheep walk was a common change in the Highlands. The landowners turned out the sheep as they once turned out the men from their estates and welcomed the new tenants, the wild beasts and the feathered birds. One can walk from the Earl of Dalhousie's estates in Forfarshire to John o' Groat's without ever leaving forest land. In many of these woods, the fox, the wild cat, the marten, the polecat, the weasel, and the alpine hare are common, whilst the rabbit, the squirrel, and the rat have lately made their way into the country. Immense tracts of land, much of which is described in the statistical account of Scotland as having a pasturage in richness and extent of very superior description, are thus shut out from all cultivation and improvement, and are solely devoted to the sport of a few persons for a very brief period of the year, unquote. The London Economist of June 2nd, 1866 says, quote, amongst the items of news in a Scotch paper of last week, we read, one of the finest sheep farms in Sutherlandshire, for which a rent of £1,200 a year was recently offered, on the expiry of the existing lease this year, is to be converted into a deer forest. Here we see the modern instincts of feudalism operating pretty much as they did when Norman the Conqueror destroyed 36 villages to create the New Forest. 2 millions of acres totally laid waste, embracing within their area some of the most fertile lands of Scotland. The natural grass of Glen Tilt was among the most nutritive in the county of Perth. The deer forest of Ben Alder was by far the best grazing ground in the wide district of Badenoch. A part of the Blackmount Forest was the best pasture for black-faced sheep in Scotland. Some idea of the ground laid waste, or purely sporting purposes in Scotland, may be formed from the fact that it embraced an area larger than the whole county of Perth. The resources of the forest of Ben Alder might give some idea of the loss sustained from the forced desolations. The ground would pasture 15,000 sheep, and as it was not more than 1/30th part of the old forest ground in Scotland, it might, etc. All that forest land is as totally unproductive. It might thus as well have been submerged under the waters of the German Ocean. It's an old name for the North Sea. Such extemporized wildernesses or deserts ought to be put down by the decided interference of the legislature, unquote. Back to the main text. The spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of the state domains, the robbery of the common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property, and its transformation into modern private property under circumstances of reckless terrorism were just so many idyllic methods of primitive accumulation. They conquered the field for capitalistic agriculture, made the soil part and parcel of capital, and created for the town industries the necessary supply of a, quote, free and outlawed proletariat. And that is the end of Chapter 27. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every contribution is encouraging, and they're also materially helpful. They allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do otherwise, so if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-life political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 28 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 28 is the third of 8 chapters in Part 8 of 8 of Capital Volume 1. In other words, we are almost at the end. Part 8 concerns primitive accumulation, or how capitalism got started, and Chapter 28's title is Bloody Legislation Against the Expropriated from the End of the 15th Century, Forcing Down of Wages by Acts of Parliament. In Chapter 27, Marx talked about the process of kicking people off of the land, And in this chapter, he's going to talk about how the recently expropriated poor, at least many of them, didn't have anywhere to go yet because capitalism was getting set up, but it really wasn't expanded to the point where it could employ a lot of these people. So we see in the last chapter description of setting up poor laws and things like that, but a lot of these people ended up homeless, and that was really a new phenomenon on this kind of scale. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at how the ruling class was trying to manage this transition, all the while keeping their own benefit in the forefront. Let's begin. The proletariat created by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers and by the forcible expropriation of the people from the soil, this, quote, free proletariat could not possibly be absorbed by the nascent manufactures as fast as it was thrown upon the world. On the other hand, these men, suddenly dragged from their wonted mode of life, could not as suddenly adapt themselves to the discipline of their new condition. They were turned en masse into beggars, robbers, vagabonds, partly from inclination, in most cases from stress of circumstances. Hence, at the end of the 15th and during the whole of the 16th century, throughout Western Europe a bloody legislation against vagabondage. The fathers of the present working class were chastised for their enforced transformation into vagabonds and paupers. Legislation treated them as, quote, voluntary criminals, and assumed that it depended on their own good will to go on working under the old conditions that no longer existed. In England, this legislation began under Henry VII. And then Marx does kind of a timeline here, starting with Henry VIII, 1530. Beggars old and unable to work receive a beggar's license. On the other hand, whipping and imprisonment for sturdy vagabonds. They are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies, then to swear an oath to go back to their birthplace, or to where they have lived in the last 3 years, and to, quote, put themselves to labor. What grim irony. In 27 Henry VIII, the former statute is repeated, but strengthened with new clauses. For the second arrest for vagabondage, the whipping is to be repeated and half the ear sliced off. But for the third relapse, the offender is to be executed as a hardened criminal, an enemy of the common weal. Edward VI, a statute of the first year of his reign, 1547, ordains that if anyone refuses to work, he shall be condemned as a slave to the person who has denounced him as an idler. The master shall feed his slave on bread and water, weak broth, and such refuse meat as he thinks fit. He has the right to force him to do any work, no matter how disgusting, with whip and chains. If the slave is absent a fortnight, he is condemned to slavery for life, and is to be branded on forehead or back with the letter S. If he runs away thrice, he is to be executed as a felon. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave, just as any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against the masters, they are also to be executed. Justices of the peace on information are to hunt the rascals down. If it happens that a vagabond has been idling about for 3 days, he is to be taken to his birthplace, branded with a red-hot iron, with the letter V on the breast, and be set to work, in chains, in the streets, or at some other labor. If the vagabond gives a false birthplace, he is then to become the slave for life of this place, of its inhabitants, or its corporation, and to be branded with an S. All persons have the right to take away the children of the vagabonds and to keep them as apprentices, the young men until the 24th year, the girls until the 20th. If they run away, they are to become up to this age the slaves of their masters, who can put them in irons, whip them, etc. if they like. Every master may put an iron ring around the neck, arms, or legs of his slave, by which to know him more easily and to be more certain of him. Footnote, the author of the Essay on Trade, etc., 1770, says, quote, in the reign of Edward VI, indeed the English seem to have set, in good earnest, about encouraging manufactures and employing the poor. This we learn from a remarkable statute which runs thus, quote, that all vagrants shall be branded, etc., unquote. Back to the main text. The last part of the statute provides that certain poor people may be employed by a place or by persons who are willing to give them food and drink and to find them work. This kind of parish slaves was kept up in England until far into the 19th century under the name of roundsmen. Elizabeth, 1572. Unlicensed beggars above 14 years of age are to be severely flogged and branded on the left ear, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. In case of a repetition of the offense, if they are over 18, they are to be executed, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. But for the third offense, they are to be executed without mercy as felons. Similar statutes, 18 Elizabeth C. 13, and another of 1597. Footnote. Thomas More says in his Utopia, quote, "Therefore that uncovetous and unsatiable cormorant, and very plague of his native country, may compass about and enclose many thousand acres of ground together within one pale or hedge. The husbandmen be thrust out of their own, or else either by cunning and fraud, or by violent oppression they be put besides it, or by wrongs and injuries they be so wearied that they be compelled to sell all. By one means, therefore, or by other, either by hook or crook, they must needs depart away. Poor, sully, wretched souls, men, women, husbands, wives, fatherless children, widows, woeful mothers with their young babes, and their whole household small in substance and much in number, as husbandry requireth many hands. Away they trudge, I say, out of their known accustomed homes, finding no place to rest in. All their household stuff, which is worth very little, though it might well abide the sale, yet being so dainly thrust out, they be constrained to sell it for a thing of naught. And just when they have wandered abroad till that be spent, what can they else do but steal, and then justly party be hanged, or else go about begging? And yet then also they be cast in prison as vagabonds, because they go about and work not, whom no man will set a work, though they never so willingly proffer themselves thereto." Unquote. Of these poor fugitives of whom Thomas More says that they were forced to thieve, quote, 7,200 great and petty thieves were put to death, unquote, in the reign of Henry VIII. It's according to Holinshed Description of England. In Elizabeth's time, quote, "rogues were trussed up apace, and that there was not 1 year commonly wherein 300 or 400 were not devoured and eaten up by the gallows." That's quoting Strype's Annals of the Reformation and Establishment of Religion and Other Various Occurrences in the Church of England during Queen Elizabeth's Happy Reign, 2nd edition, 1725, Volume 2. According to this same Strype, in Somersetshire in 1 year 40 persons were executed, 35 robbers burned in the hand, 37 whipped, and 183 discharged as, quote, "incorrigible vagabonds." Nevertheless, he is of opinion that this large number of prisoners does not comprise even a fifth of the actual criminals, thanks to the negligence of the justices and the foolish compassion of the people. Okay. And the other counties of England were not better off in this respect than Somersetshire, while some were even worse. Back to the main text. James I. Anyone wandering about and begging is declared a rogue and a vagabond. Justices of the peace and petty sessions are authorized to have them publicly whipped, and for the first offense to imprison them for 6 months, for the second for 2 years. Whilst in prison they are to be whipped as much and as often as the justices of the peace think fit. Incorrigible and dangerous rogues are to be branded with an R on the left shoulder and set to hard labor, and if they are caught begging again, to be executed without mercy. These statutes, legally binding until the beginning of the 18th century, were only repealed by 12 Anne, chapter 23. Similar laws in France, where by the middle of the 17th century a kingdom of vagabonds, or truands, was established in Paris. Even at the beginning of Louis XVI's reign, the Ordinance of July 13, 1777, every man in good health from 16 to 60 years of age, if without means of subsistence and not practicing a trade, is to be sent to the galleys. Of the same nature are the statute of Charles V for the Netherlands, October 1537, the first edict of the States and Towns of Holland, March 10, 1614, the Plaquet of the United Provinces, June 26, 1649, etc. Thus were the agricultural people, first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, tortured by laws grotesquely terrible, into the discipline necessary for the wage system. It is not enough that the conditions of labor are concentrated in a mass in the shape of capital at the one pole of society, while at the other are grouped masses of men who have nothing to sell but their labor power. Neither is it enough that they are compelled to sell it voluntarily. The advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The constant generation of a relative surplus population keeps the law of supply and demand of labor, and therefore keeps wages in a rut that corresponds with the wants of capital. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of the laborer to the capitalist. Direct force, outside economic conditions, is of course still used, but only exceptionally. In the ordinary run of things, the laborer can be left to the, quote, natural laws of production, i.e., to their dependence on capital, a dependence springing from, and guaranteed in perpetuity by, the conditions of production themselves. It is otherwise during the historic genesis of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie, at its rise, wants and uses the power of the state to, quote, regulate wages. i.e. to force them within the limits suitable for surplus value making, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the laborer themselves in the normal degree of dependence. This is an essential element of the so-called primitive accumulation. The class of wage laborers, which arose in the latter half of the 14th century, formed then and in the following century only a very small part of the population, well protected in its position by the independent peasant proprietary in the country and the guild organization in the town. In country and town, master and workman stood close together socially. The subordination of labor to capital was only formal, i.e., the mode of production itself had as yet no specific capitalistic character. Variable capital preponderated greatly over constant. The demand for wage labor grew, therefore, rapidly with every accumulation of capital, whilst the supply of wage labor followed but slowly. A large part of the national product, changed later into a fund of capitalist accumulation, then still entered into the consumption fund of the laborer. Legislation on wage labor, from the first aimed at the exploitation of the laborer and, as it advanced, always equally hostile to him, is started in England by the Statute of Laborers of Edward III, 1349. Footnote quoting Adam Smith, whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its counselors are always the masters. Quoting Langay, the spirit of the laws is property. Back to the main text. The Ordinance of 1350 in France, issued in the name of King John, corresponds with it. English and French legislation run parallel and are identical in purport. So far as the labor statutes aim at compulsory extension of the working day, I do not return to them, as this point was treated earlier, Chapter 10, Section 5. The Statute of Laborers was passed at the urgent insistence of the House of Commons. A Tory says naively, quote, "Formerly the poor demanded such high wages as to threaten industry and wealth. Next, their wages are so low as to threaten industry and wealth equally and perhaps more, but in another way." That's quoting Sophisms of Free Trade by a barrister, London, 1850. He adds maliciously, quote, "We were ready enough to interfere for the employer. Can nothing now be done for the employed?" Unquote. A tariff of wages was fixed by law for town and country, for piecework and day work. The agricultural laborers were to hire themselves out by the year, the town ones, quote, "in open market." It was forbidden under pain of imprisonment to pay higher wages than those fixed by the statute, but the taking of higher wages was more severely punished than the giving of them. So also in sections 18 and 19 of the Statute of Apprentices of Elizabeth, 10 days imprisonment is decreed for him that pays the higher wages, but 21 days for him that receives them. A statute of 1360 increased the penalties and authorized the masters to extort labor at the legal rate of wages by corporal punishment. All combinations, contracts, oaths, etc., by which masons and carpenters reciprocally bound themselves, were declared null and void. Coalition of the laborers is treated as a heinous crime from the 14th century to 1825, the year of the repeal of the laws against trades unions. The spirit of the Statute of Laborers of 1349 and of its offshoots comes out clearly in the fact that indeed a maximum of wages is dictated by the state, but on no account a minimum. In the 16th century, the condition of the laborers had, as we know, become much worse. The money wage rose, but not in proportion to the depreciation of money and the corresponding rise in the prices of commodities. Wages, therefore, in reality fell. Nevertheless, the laws for keeping them down remained in force, together with the ear-clipping and branding of those, quote, "whom no one was willing to take into service," unquote, i.e. the unemployed. By the Statute of Apprentices, 5 Elizabeth, Chapter 3, the justices of the peace were empowered to fix certain wages and to modify them according to the time of year and the price of commodities. James I extended these regulations of labor also to weavers, spinners, and all possible categories of workers. Footnote, from a clause of Statute 2, James I, Chapter 6, we see that certain cloth makers took upon themselves to dictate, in their capacity of justices of the peace, the official tariff of wages in their own shops. In Germany, especially after the 30 Years' War, statutes for keeping down wages were general. Quote, "The want of servants and laborers was very troublesome to the landed proprietors in the depopulated districts. All villagers were forbidden to let rooms to single men and women. All the latter were to be reported to the authorities and cast into prison if they were unwilling to become servants, even if they were employed at any other work, such as sowing seeds for the peasants at a daily wage or even buying and selling corn." That's from the Imperial Privileges and Sanctions for Silesia 1. For a whole century, in the decrees of the small German potentates, a bitter cry goes up again and again about the wicked and impertinent rabble that will not reconcile itself to its hard lot, will not be content with the legal wage. The individual landed proprietors are forbidden to pay more than the state had fixed by a tariff, and yet the conditions of service were at times better after war than 100 years later. The farm servants of Silesia had, in 1652, meat twice a week, whilst even in our century districts are known where they have it only 3 times a year. Further, wages after the war were higher than in the following century." Unquote. That's from G. Freytag. Back to the main text. George II extended the laws against coalitions of laborers to manufactures. In the manufacturing period par excellence, the capitalist mode of production had become sufficiently strong to render legal regulation of wages as impractical as it was unnecessary. But the ruling classes were unwilling, in case of necessity, to be without the weapons of the old arsenal. Still, 8 George II forbade a higher day's wage than 2 shillings 7.5 pence for journeyman tailors in and around London, except in cases of general mourning. Still, 13 George III, Chapter 68, gave the regulation of the wages of silk weavers to the justices of the peace. Still, in 1706, it required 2 judgments of the higher courts to decide whether the mandates of justices of the peace as to wages held good also for non-agricultural laborers. Still, in 1799, an Act of Parliament ordered that the wages of the Scotch miners should continue to be regulated by a statute of Elizabeth and 2 Scotch Acts of 1661 and 1671. How completely, in the meantime, circumstances had changed is proved by an occurrence unheard of before in the English lower house. In that place, where for more than 400 years laws had been made for the maximum, beyond which wages absolutely must not rise, Whitbread in 1796 proposed a legal minimum wage for agricultural laborers. Pitt opposed this, but confessed that the, quote, condition of the poor was cruel, unquote. Thoughts and prayers, I guess. Finally, in 1813, the laws for the regulation of wages were repealed. They were an absurd anomaly, since the capitalist regulated his factory by his private legislation, and could by the poor rates make up the wage of the agricultural laborer to the indispensable minimum. The provisions of the labor statutes as to contracts between master and workman, as to giving notice and the like, which only allow of a civil action against the contract-breaking master, but on the contrary permit a criminal action against the contract-breaking workman, are to this hour, 1873, in full force. The barbarous laws against trades unions fell in 1825 before the threatening bearing of the proletariat. Despite this, they fell only in part. Certain beautiful fragments of the old statute vanished only in 1859. Finally, the Act of Parliament of June 29, 1871, made a pretense of removing the last traces of this class of legislation by legal recognition of trades unions. But an Act of Parliament of the same date, an act to amend the criminal law relating to violence, threats, and molestation, re-established in point of fact the former state of things in a new shape. By this parliamentary sleight of hand, the means which the laborers could use in a strike or lockout were withdrawn from the laws common to all citizens, and placed under exceptional penal legislation, the interpretation of which fell to the masters themselves in their capacity as justices of the peace. 2 years earlier, the same House of Commons and the same Mr. Gladstone, in the well-known straightforward fashion, brought in a bill for the abolition of all exceptional penal legislation against the working class. But this was never allowed to go beyond the second reading, and the matter was thus protracted until at last the, quote, great Liberal party, by an alliance with the Tories, found courage to turn against the very proletariat that had carried it into power. Not content with this treachery, the great Liberal party allowed the English judges, ever complacent in the service of the ruling classes, to dig up again the earlier laws against conspiracy, and to apply them to coalitions of laborers. We see that only against its will and under the pressure of the masses did the English Parliament give up the laws against strikes and trades unions, after it had itself for 500 years held with shameless egoism the position of a permanent trades union of the capitalists against the laborers. During the very first storms of the Revolution, the French bourgeoisie dared to take away from the workers the right of association but just acquired. By a decree of June 14, 1791, they declared all coalition of the workers as a, quote, attempt against liberty and the declaration of the rights of man, unquote, punishable by a fine of 500 livres, together with deprivation of the rights of an active citizen for 1 year. Footnote, Article 1 of this law runs, quote, as the abolition of any form of association between citizens of the same estate and profession is one of the foundations of the French Constitution, it is forbidden to re-establish them under any pretext or in any form, whatever they might be. Citizens belonging to the same profession, craft, or trade have joint discussions and make joint decisions with the intention of refusing together to perform their trade or insisting together on providing the services of their trade or their labors only at a particular price, then the said deliberations and agreements shall be declared unconstitutional, derogatory to liberty and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, etc. That's quoting Revolutions of Paris, 1791. Back to the main text. This law, which, by means of state compulsion, confined the struggle between capital and labor within limits comfortable for capital, has outlived revolutions and changes of dynasties. Even the reign of terror left it untouched. It was but quite recently struck out of the penal code. Nothing is more characteristic than the pretext for this bourgeois coup d'etat. Granting, says Chapelier, the reporter of the Select Committee on this law, quote, that wages ought to be a little higher than they are, that they ought to be high enough for him that receives them, to be free of that state of absolute dependence, due to the want of the necessaries of life, and which is almost that of slavery, unquote. Yet the workers must not be allowed to come to any understanding about their own interests, nor to act in common, and thereby lessen their, quote, absolute dependence, which is almost that of slavery, unquote, because forsooth in doing this they injure, quote, the freedom of their ci-devant masters, the present entrepreneurs, unquote, and because a coalition against the despotism of the former masters of the corporations is, guess what, a restoration of the corporations abolished by the French Constitution. And that is the end of Chapter 28. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So thank you very much. We don't run ads on this channel. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 29 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 29 is titled Genesis of the Capitalist Farmer, and it's the fourth chapter in Part 8 of 8, Primitive Accumulation. In this last part of Capital Volume 1, we have mostly been focused on how the people were ripped away from the land and made dependent on capitalists, but where did the capitalist come from? That's what Marx is going to talk about in this chapter, which is pretty short, so let's just get into it. Now that we've considered the forcible creation of a class of outlawed proletarians, the bloody discipline that turned them into wage laborers, the disgraceful action of the state, which employed the police to accelerate the accumulation of capital by increasing the degree of exploitation of labor, the question remains, whence came the capitalists originally? For the expropriation of the agricultural population creates directly none but the greatest landed proprietors. As far, however, as concerns the genesis of the farmer, we can, so to say, put our hand on it, because it is a slow process evolving through many centuries. The serfs as well as the free small proprietors held land under very different tenures, and were therefore emancipated under very different economic conditions. In England, the first form of the farmer is the bailiff, himself a serf. His position is similar to that of the old Roman villicus, only in a more limited sphere of action. During the second half of the 14th century, he is replaced by a farmer, whom the landlord provided with seed, cattle, and implements. His condition is not very different from that of the peasant, only he exploits more wage labor. Soon he becomes a métayer, a half-farmer. He advances one part of the agricultural stock, the landlord the other. The two divide the total product in proportions determined by contract. This form quickly disappears in England to give place to the farmer proper, who makes his own capital breed by employing wage laborers, and pays a part of the surplus product, in money or in kind, to the landlord as rent. So long during the 15th century as the independent peasant and the farm laborer working for himself as well as for wages enriched themselves by their own labor, the circumstances of the farmer and his field of production were equally mediocre. The agricultural revolution, which commenced in the last third of the 15th century and continued during almost the whole of the 16th, excepting however its last decade, enriched him just as speedily as it impoverished the mass of the agricultural people. Footnote, Harrison, in his description of England, says, quote, although peradventure 4 pounds of old rent be improved to 40, toward the end of his term, if he have not 6 or 7 years' rent lying by him, 50 or 100 pounds, yet will the farmer think his gains very small. Unquote, back to the main text. The usurpation of the common lands allowed him to augment greatly his stock of cattle, almost without cost, whilst they yielded him a richer supply of manure for the tillage of the soil. To this was added in the 16th century a very important element. At that time, the contracts for farms ran for a long time, often for 99 years. The progressive fall in the value of the precious metals, and therefore of money, brought the farmers golden fruit. Apart from all the other circumstances discussed above, it lowered wages. A portion of the latter was now added to the profits of the farm. The continuous rise in the price of corn, wool, meat, in a word of all agricultural produce, swelled the money capital of the farm without any action on his part, whilst the rent he paid, being calculated on the old value of money, diminished in reality. Footnote: on the influence of the depreciation of money in the 16th century on the different classes of society, see a compendium of brief examination of certain ordinary complaints of divers of our countrymen in these our days by W.S. Gentleman, London, 1581. The dialogue form of this work led people for a long time to ascribe it to Shakespeare, and even in 1751 it was published under his name. Its author is William Stafford. In one place the knight reasons as follows: Knight, you, my neighbor, the husbandman, you Meister Mercer, and you Goodman Cooper, with other artificers, may save yourselves meetly well. For as much as all things are dearer than they were, so much do you arise in the price of your wares and occupations, that ye sell again. But we have nothing to sell, whereby we might advance ye price thereof, to countervail those things that we must buy again. Unquote. In another place the knight asks the doctor, quote, I pray you, what be those sorts that ye mean? And first, of those that ye think should have no loss thereby. Doctor, I mean all those that live by buying and selling, for as they buy dear, they sell thereafter. Knight, what is the next sort that ye say would win by it? Doctor, marry, all such as have takings of farms in their own manurance, cultivation, at the old rent, for where they pay after the old rate they sell after the new. That is, they pay for their land good cheap, and sell all things growing thereof dear. Knight, what sort is that which ye said should have greater loss hereby than these men had profit? Doctor, it is all noblemen, gentlemen, and all other that live either by a stinted rent or stipend, or do not manure, cultivate the ground, or do occupy no buying and selling. Unquote. Back to the main text. Thus they grew rich at the expense both of their laborers and their landlords. No wonder, therefore, that England at the end of the 16th century had a class of capitalist farmers, rich, considering the circumstances of the time. Footnote: in France, the régisseur, steward, collector of dues for the feudal lords during the earlier part of the Middle Ages, soon became a businessman who, by extortion, cheating, etc., swindled himself into a capitalist. These régisseurs themselves were sometimes noblemen. For example, quote, this is the account given by M. Jacques de Torres, knight and lord of a manor near Besançon, to the lord who administers the accounts at Dijon for his Highness the Duke and Count of Burgundy, of the rents appurtenant to the above-mentioned manor, from the 25th day of December 1359 to the 28th day of December 1360. That's quoting Alexis Montet. Already it is evident here how in all spheres of social life the lion's share falls to the middleman. In the economic domain, for example, financiers, stock exchange speculators, merchants, shopkeepers skim the cream. In civil matters, the lawyer fleeces his clients. In politics, the representative is of more importance than the voters, the minister than the sovereign. In religion, God is pushed into the background by the mediator, and the latter again is shoved back by the priests, the inevitable middlemen, between the good shepherd and his sheep. In France, as in England, the great feudal territories were divided into innumerable small homesteads, but under conditions incomparably more favorable for the people. During the 14th century arose the farms, or terriers. Their number grew constantly, far beyond 100,000. They paid rents varying from 1/12 to 1/5 of the product in money or in kind. These farms were fiefs, sub-fiefs, etc., according to the value and extent of the domains, many of them only containing a few acres. But these farmers had rights of jurisdiction in some degree over the dwellers on the soil. There were 4 grades. The oppression of the agricultural population under all these petty tyrants will be understood. Montet says that there were once in France 160,000 judges, where today 4,000 tribunals, including justices of the peace, suffice. And that is the end of Chapter 29. Marx's summary of the genesis of the capitalist farmer. Pretty simple. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall, or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. We don't run ads on this channel and don't plan to, so if you like this channel and want to see more of it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 30 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, in the last chapter, we read about the genesis of the capitalist farmer, and in the next chapter, chapter 31, we're going to read about the genesis of the industrial capitalist. This chapter, chapter 30, is titled The Reaction of the Agricultural Revolution on Industry, Creation of the Home Market for Industrial Capital, and it's kind of a bridge between those two chapters, describing how the rise of the capitalist farmer paved the way for the rise of industrial capitalism. Again, this is a pretty short chapter, so let's just jump in. The expropriation and expulsion of the agricultural population, intermittent but renewed again and again, supplied, as we saw, the town industries with a mass of proletarians entirely unconnected with the corporate guilds and unfettered by them. A fortunate circumstance that makes old A. Anderson, not to be confounded with James Anderson, in his History of Commerce, believe in the direct intervention of capital P Providence. We must still pause a moment on this element of primitive accumulation. The thinning out of the independent, self-supporting peasants not only brought about the crowding together of the industrial proletariat, in the way that Geoffrey St. Hilaire, in his Notions of Natural Philosophy, 1838, explained the condensation of cosmical matter at one place by its rarefaction at another. In spite of the smaller number of its cultivators, the soil brought forth as much or more produce after as before, because the revolution in the conditions of landed property was accompanied by improved methods of culture, greater cooperation, concentration of the means of production, etc., and because not only were the agricultural wage laborers put on the strain more intensely, a point that Sir James Stewart emphasizes, but the field of production on which they worked for themselves became more and more contracted. With the setting free of a part of the agricultural population, therefore, their former means of nourishment were also set free. They were now transformed into material elements of variable capital. The peasant, expropriated and cast adrift, must buy their value in the form of wages from their new master, the industrial capitalist. That which holds good of the means of subsistence holds with the raw materials of industry dependent upon home agriculture. They were transformed into an element of constant capital. Suppose, for example, a part of the Westphalian peasants who, at the time of Frederick II, all span flax, forcibly expropriated and hunted from the soil, and the other part that remained turned into day laborers of large farmers. At the same time arise large establishments for flax spinning and weaving, in which the men, quote-unquote, set free, now work for wages. The flax looks exactly as before. Not a fiber of it is changed, but a new social soul has popped into its body. It forms now a part of the constant capital of the master manufacturer. Formerly divided among a number of small producers who cultivated it themselves, and with their families spun it in retail fashion, it is now concentrated in the hand of one capitalist who sets others to spin and weave it for him. The extra labor expended in flax spinning realized itself formerly in extra income to numerous peasant families, or maybe in Frederick II's time in taxes for the King of Prussia. It realizes itself now in profit for a few capitalists. The spindles and looms, formerly scattered over the face of the country, are now crowded together in a few great labor barracks, together with the laborers and the raw material. And spindles, looms, raw material are now transformed from means of independent existence for the spinners and weavers into means for commanding them and sucking out of them unpaid labor. Footnote, quote, "I will allow you, says the capitalist, to have the honor of serving me on condition that, in return for the pains I take in commanding you, you give me the little that remains to you." That's quoting J.J. Rousseau's Discourse on Political Economy. Back to the main text. One does not perceive, when looking at the large manufactories and the large farms, that they've originated from the throwing into one of many small centers of production and have been built up by the expropriation of many small independent producers. Nevertheless, the popular intuition was not at fault. In the time of Mirabeau, the Lion of the Revolution, the great manufactories were still called reunited manufactures, workshops thrown into one, as we speak of fields thrown into one. Says Mirabeau, quote, "We are only paying attention to the grand manufactories, in which hundreds of men work under a director, and which are commonly called manufactures réunies. Those where a very large number of laborers work, each separately and on his own account, are hardly considered. They're placed at an infinite distance from the others. This is a great error, as the latter alone make a really important object of national prosperity. The large workshop, manufacture réunie, will enrich prodigiously one or two entrepreneurs, but the laborers will only be journeymen, paid more or less, and will not have any share in the success of the undertaking. In the discrete workshop, or separate manufacture, on the contrary, no one will become rich, but many laborers will be comfortable. The saving and the industrious will be able to amass a little capital, to put by a little for a birth of a child, for an illness, for themselves or their belongings. The number of saving and industrious laborers will increase because they will see in good conduct, in activity, a means of essentially bettering their condition, and not of obtaining a small rise in wages that can never be of any importance of the future, and whose sole result is to place men in the position to live a little better, but only from day to day. The large workshops, undertakings of certain private persons who pay laborers from day to day to work for their gain, may be able to put these private individuals at their ease, but they will never be an object worth the attention of governments. Discrete workshops, for the most part combined with cultivation of small holdings, are the only free ones." Unquote. Marx adds in a footnote that Mirabeau considers the separate workshops more economical and productive than the combined, and sees in the latter merely artificial exotics under government cultivation is explained by the position at that time of a great part of the continental manufactures. Back to the main text. The expropriation and eviction of a part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital the laborers, their means of subsistence and material for labor, it also created the home market. In fact, the events that transformed the small peasants into wage laborers, and their means of subsistence and of labor into material elements of capital, created at the same time a home market for the latter. Formerly, the peasant family produced the means of subsistence and the raw materials which they themselves, for the most part, consumed. These raw materials and means of subsistence have now become commodities. The large farmer sells them. He finds his market in manufactures. Yarn, linen, coarse woolen stuffs, things whose raw materials had been within the reach of every peasant family, had been spun and woven by it for its own use, were now transformed into articles of manufacture, to which the country districts at once served for markets. The many scattered customers whom stray artisans until now had found in the numerous small producers working on their own account, concentrate themselves now into one great market provided for by industrial capital. Footnote, quoting David Urquhart, 20 pounds of wool converted unobtrusively into yearly clothing of a laborer's family by its own industry in the intervals of other works, this makes no show, but bring it to market, send it to the factory, thence to the broker, thence to the dealer, and you will have great commercial operations, and nominal capital engaged to the amount of 20 times its value. The working class is thus immersed to support a wretched factory population, a parasitical shopkeeping class, and a fictitious commercial, monetary, and financial system. Unquote. Back to the main text. Thus, hand in hand with the expropriation of the self-supporting peasants, with their separation from their means of production, goes the destruction of rural domestic industry, the process of separation between manufacture and agriculture. And only the destruction of rural domestic industry can give the internal market of a country that extension and consistence which the capitalist mode of production requires. Still, the manufacturing period, properly so called, does not succeed in carrying out this transformation radically and completely. It will be remembered that manufacture, properly so called, conquers but partially the domain of national production, and always rests on the handicrafts of the town and the domestic industry of the rural districts as its ultimate basis. If it destroys these in one form, in particular branches, at certain points, it calls them up again elsewhere, because it needs them for the preparation of raw material up to a certain point. It produces, therefore, a new class of small villagers who, while following the cultivation of the soil as an accessory calling, find their chief occupation in industrial labor, the products of which they sell to the manufacturers directly, or through the medium of merchants. This is one, though not the chief cause of a phenomenon which at first puzzles the student of English history. Footnote, Cromwell's time forms an exception. So long as the Republic lasted, the mass of the English people of all grades rose from the degradation into which they had sunk under the Tudors. Back to the main text. From the last third of the 15th century, he finds continually complaints, only interrupted at certain intervals, about the encroachment of capitalist farming in the country districts, and the progressive destruction of the peasantry. On the other hand, he always finds this peasantry turning up again, although in diminished number, and always under worse conditions. The chief reason is, England is at one time chiefly a cultivator of corn, at another chiefly a breeder of cattle, in alternate periods, and with these, the extent of peasant cultivation fluctuates. Modern industry alone, and finally supplies, in machinery, the lasting basis of capitalistic agriculture, expropriates radically the enormous majority of the agricultural population, and completes the separation between agriculture and rural domestic industry, whose roots, spinning and weaving, it tears up. Footnote, Tuckett is aware that the modern woolen industry has sprung, with the introduction of machinery, from manufacture proper, and from the destruction of rural and domestic industries. Quoting Urquhart, the plow, the yoke were, quote, the invention of gods and the occupation of heroes, unquote. Are the loom, the spindle, the distaff of less noble parentage? You sever the distaff and the plow, the spindle and the yoke, and you get factories and poorhouses, credit and panics, two hostile nations, agricultural and commercial, unquote. But now comes Carey, and cries out upon England, surely not with unreason, that it is trying to turn every other country into a mere agricultural nation, whose manufacturer is to be England. He pretends that in this way Turkey has been ruined because, quote, the owners and occupants of land have never been permitted by England to strengthen themselves by the formation of that natural alliance between the plow and the loom, the hammer and the harrow, unquote. That's from his The Slave Trade. According to him, Urquhart himself is one of the chief agents in the ruin of Turkey, where he had made free trade propaganda in the English interest. The best of it is that Carey, a great Russophile by the way, wants to prevent the process of separation by that very system of protection which accelerates it. Back to the main text. It therefore also, for the first time, conquers for industrial capital the entire home market. Footnote, philanthropic English economists like Mill, Rogers, Goldwin Smith, Fawcett, etc., and liberal manufacturers like John Bright and Company, ask the English landed proprietors, as God asked Cain after Abel, where are our thousands of freeholders gone? But where do you come from then? From the destruction of those freeholders. Why don't you ask further, where are the independent weavers, spinners, and artisans gone? And that is the end of Capital Volume 1, Chapter 30. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. We don't run ads on this channel and don't plan to, so if you like this channel and want to see more from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here and apply it to your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook of Chapter 31, Genesis of the Industrial Capitalist from Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 31 is the fifth out of 8 chapters in Part 8 of 8 of Capital Volume 1, Primitive Accumulation, which concerns how capitalism emerged out of feudalism in what Marx calls the classic case of England. 2 chapters ago, we discussed the genesis of the capitalist farmer, and then in the last chapter, we discussed how that farming led to more changes which paved the way for more capitalism. And that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter, the additional capitalism that resulted. We're going to start out with a note from Marx about industrial capitalism as a term. Industrial is used here in contradistinction to agricultural, as discussed before. However, in the categoric sense, the farmer is an industrial capitalist as much as is the manufacturer. That's the end of the note. With that noted, I want to say this is a very interesting chapter that we're about to do. But whereas the genesis of the capitalist farmer was a straightforward and brief chapter, this is pretty much the opposite. It's not super long, but it goes all over the world in a discussion of colonialism, which we're also going to revisit in chapter 33, the slave trade, how things going on abroad were affecting what was going on in England and in other parts of Europe. So there's a lot of broad and messy pieces that Marx is pulling together here in his analysis. Let's begin. The genesis of the industrial capitalist did not proceed in such a gradual way as that of the farmer. Doubtless many small guild masters and yet more independent small artisans, or even wage laborers, transformed themselves into small capitalists, and by gradually extending exploitation of wage labor and corresponding accumulation into full-blown capitalists. In the infancy of capitalist production, things often happened as in the infancy of medieval towns, where the question, which of the escaped serfs should be master and which servant, was in great part decided by the earlier or later date of their flight. The snail's pace of this method corresponded in no wise with the commercial requirements of the New World market that the great discoveries of the end of the 15th century created. But the Middle Ages had handed down two distinct forms of capital, which mature in the most different economic social formations, and which before the era of the capitalist mode of production are considered as capital all the same, usurer's capital and merchant's capital. Quoting Thomas Hodgkin's The Natural and Artificial Rights of Property Contrasted, 1832, at present, all the wealth of society goes first into the possession of the capitalist. He pays the landowner his rent, the laborer his wages, the tax and the tithe-gatherer their claims, and keeps a large, indeed the largest, and a continually augmenting share of the annual produce of labor for himself. The capitalist may now be said to be the first owner of all the wealth of the community, though no law has conferred on him the right to this property. This change has been effected by the taking of interest on capital. And it is not a little curious that all the lawgivers of Europe endeavored to prevent this by statutes, viz. By statutes against usury. The power of the capitalist over all the wealth of the country is a complete change in the right of property. And by what law, or series of laws, was it effected? Unquote. The author should have remembered that revolutions are not made by laws. The money capital formed by means of usury and commerce was prevented from turning into industrial capital in the country by the feudal constitution, in the towns by the guild organization. Footnote, even as late as 1794, the small cloth makers of Leeds sent a deputation to Parliament with a petition for a law to forbid any merchant from becoming a manufacturer, according to Dr. Aiken. Back to the main text. These fetters vanished with the dissolution of feudal society, with the expropriation and partial eviction of the country population. The new manufactures were established at seaports or at inland points beyond the control of the old municipalities and their guilds. Hence in England, an embittered struggle of the corporate towns against these new industrial nurseries. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe for a theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes giant dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin war, and is still going on in the opium wars against China, etc. The different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now, more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. In England at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination, embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend in part on brute force, for example, the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. Of the Christian colonial system, W. Howitt, a man who makes a specialty of Christianity, says, quote, "The barbarities and desperate outrages of the so-called Christian race, throughout every region of the world and upon every people they have been able to subdue, are not to be paralleled by those of any other race, however fierce, however untaught, and however reckless of mercy and of shame in any age of the earth." That's quoting William Howitt's Colonization and Christianity, a popular history of the treatment of the natives by the Europeans in all their colonies, London, 1838. On the treatment of the slaves, there is a good compilation in Charles Comte, Treaty of the Legislation, 3rd edition, Brussels, 1837. This subject one must study in detail to see what the bourgeoisie makes of itself and of the laborer, wherever it can, without restraint, to model the world after its own image. Back to the main text. The history of the colonial administration of Holland, and Holland was the head capitalistic nation of the 17th century, quote, is one of the most extraordinary relations of treachery, bribery, massacre, and meanness. That's quoting Thomas Stamford Raffles, late Lieutenant Governor of the island of Java, in his The History of Java, London, 1817. Nothing is more characteristic than their system of stealing men to get slaves for Java. The men stealers were trained for this purpose. The thief, the interpreter, and the seller were the chief agents in this trade. Native princes the chief sellers. The young people stolen were thrown into the secret dungeons of Celebes, an island in Indonesia now known as Sulawesi, until they were ready for sending to the slave ships. An official report says, quote, this one town of Makassar, for example, is full of secret prisons, one more horrible than the other, crammed with unfortunates, victims of greed and tyranny fettered in chains, forcibly torn from their families, unquote. To secure Malacca in Malaysia, the Dutch corrupted the Portuguese governor. He let them into the town in 1641. They hurried at once to his house and assassinated him, to, quote, abstain from the payment of £21,875, the price of his treason. Wherever they set foot, devastation and depopulation followed. Banjawangi, a province of Java, in 1750 numbered over 80,000 inhabitants. In 1811, only 18,000. Sweet commerce. The English East India Company, as is well known, obtained, besides the political rule in India, the exclusive monopoly of the tea trade, as well as of the Chinese trade in general, and of the transport of goods to and from Europe. But the coasting trade of India and between the islands, as well as the internal trade of India, were the monopoly of the higher employees of the company. The monopolies of salt, opium, betel, and other commodities were inexhaustible mines of wealth. The employees themselves fixed the price and plundered at will the unhappy Hindus. The Governor-General took part in this private traffic. His favorites received contracts under conditions whereby they, cleverer than the alchemists, made gold out of nothing. Great fortunes sprang up like mushrooms in a day. Primitive accumulation went on without the advance of a shilling. The trial of Warren Hastings swarms with such cases. Here's an instance. A contract for opium was given to a certain Sullivan at the moment of his departure on an official mission to a part of India far removed from the opium district. Sullivan sold his contract to one Bin for £40,000. Bin sold it the same day for £60,000, and the ultimate purchaser who carried out the contract declared that after all he realized an enormous gain. According to one of the lists laid before Parliament, the company and its employees from 1757 to 1766 got £6 million from the Indians as gifts. Between 1769 and 1770, the English manufactured a famine by buying up all the rice and refusing to sell it again except at fabulous prices. Comment see Housing Market, United States, present day. Footnote, in the year 1866, more than 1 million Hindus died of hunger in the province of Orissa alone. Nevertheless, the attempt was made to enrich the Indian treasury by the price at which the necessaries of life were sold to the starving people. Back to the main text. The treatment of the Aborigines was naturally most frightful in plantation colonies destined for export trade only, such as the West Indies, and in rich and well-populated countries, such as Mexico and India, that were given over to plunder. But even in the colonies properly so called, the Christian character of primitive accumulation did not belie itself. Those sober virtuosi of Protestantism, the Puritans of New England, in 1703, by decrees of their assembly, set a premium of £40 on every Indian scalp and every captured redskin. In 1720, a premium of £100 on every scalp. In 1744, after Massachusetts Bay had proclaimed a certain tribe as rebels, the following prices. For a male scalp of 12 years and upwards, £100 in the new currency. For a male prisoner, £105. For women and children prisoners, £50. For scalps of women and children, £50. Comment, that's right, they were paying people £50 to scalp children. Continuing, some decades later, the colonial system took its revenge on the descendants of the pious Pilgrim Fathers, who had grown seditious in the meantime. At English instigation and for English pay, they were tomahawked by redskins. The British Parliament proclaimed bloodhounds and scalping as, quote, means that God and nature had given into its hand, unquote. The colonial system ripened, like a hothouse, trade and navigation. The society's monopolia of Luther were powerful levers for concentration of capital. The colonies secured a market for the budding manufacturers, and through the monopoly of the market, an increased accumulation. The treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder floated back to the mother country and were there turned into capital. Holland, which first fully developed the colonial system, in 1648 stood already in the acme of its commercial greatness. It was, quote, in almost exclusive possession of the East Indian trade and the commerce between the southeast and northwest of Europe. Its fisheries, marine, manufactures surpassed those of any other country. The total capital of the Republic was probably more important than that of all the rest of Europe put together, unquote. Gulick forgets to add that by 1648 the people of Holland were more overworked, poorer, and more brutally oppressed than those of all the rest of Europe put together. Today, industrial supremacy implies commercial supremacy. In the period of manufacture properly so called, it is on the other hand the commercial supremacy that gives industrial predominance. Hence the preponderant role that the colonial system plays at that time. It was the strange god who perched himself on the altar cheek by jowl with the old gods of Europe, and one fine day with a shove and a kick chucked them all of a heap. It proclaimed surplus value making as the sole end and aim of humanity. The system of public credit, i.e. of national debts whose origin we discover in Genoa and Venice as early as the Middle Ages, took possession of Europe generally during the manufacturing period, the colonial system with its maritime trade and commercial wars serving as a forcing house for it. Thus it first took root in Holland. National debts, i.e. the alienation of the state, whether despotic, constitutional, or republican, marked with its stamp the capitalistic era. The only part of the so-called national wealth that actually enters into the collective possessions of modern peoples is their national debt. Footnote. William Cobbett remarks that in England, all public institutions are designated royal. As compensation for this, however, there is the national debt. Back to the main text. Hence, as a necessary consequence, the modern doctrine that the richer a nation becomes, the more deeply it is in debt. Public credit becomes the credo of capital, and with the rise of national debt-making, want of faith in the national debt takes the place of the blasphemy against the Holy Ghost, which may not be forgiven. The public debt becomes one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation. As with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, it endows barren money with the power of breeding, and thus turns it into capital, without the necessity of its exposing itself to the troubles and risks inseparable from its employment in industry or even in usury. The state creditors actually give nothing away, for the sum lent is transformed into public bonds, easily negotiable, which go on functioning in their hands just as so much hard cash would. But further, apart from the class of lazy annuitants thus created, and from the improvised wealth of the financiers, middlemen between the government and the nation, as also apart from the tax farmers, merchants, private manufacturers, to whom a good part of every national loan renders the service of a capital fallen from heaven, the national debt has given rise to joint stock companies, to dealings in negotiable effects of all kinds, and to adjutage, in a word, to stock exchange gambling and the modern bankocracy. At their birth, the great banks, decorated with national titles, were only associations of private speculators who placed themselves by the side of governments, and thanks to the privileges they received, were in a position to advance money to the state. Hence the accumulation of the national debt has no more infallible measure than the successive rise in the stock of these banks, whose full development dates from the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. The Bank of England began with lending its money to the government at 8%. At the same time, it was empowered by Parliament to coin money out of the same capital. By lending it again to the public in the form of banknotes, it was allowed to use these notes for discounting bills, making advances on commodities, and for buying the precious metals. It was not long ere this credit money, made by the bank itself, became the coin in which the Bank of England made its loans to the state, and paid, on account of the state, the interest on the public debt. It was not enough that the bank gave with one hand and took back more with the other. It remained, even whilst receiving, the eternal creditor of the nation down to the last shilling advanced. Gradually, it became inevitably the receptacle of the metallic hoard of the country, and the center of gravity of all commercial credit. What effect was produced on their contemporaries by the sudden uprising of this brood of bankocrats, financiers, rentiers, brokers, stock jobbers, etc. is proved by the writings of that time, for example by Bolingbroke's. Footnote quoting Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, if the Tartars were to flood into Europe today, it would be a difficult job to make them understand what a financier is with us, unquote. Back to the main text. With the national debt arose an international credit system, which often conceals one of the sources of primitive accumulation in this or that people. Thus, the villainies of the Venetian thieving system formed one of the secret bases of the capital wealth of Holland, to whom Venice in her decadence lent large sums of money. So also was it with Holland and England. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Dutch manufacturers were far outstripped. Holland had ceased to be the nation preponderant in commerce and industry. One of its main lines of business, therefore, from 1701 to 1776, is the lending out of enormous amounts of capital, especially to its great rival, England. The same thing is going on today between England and the United States. A great deal of capital, which appears today in the United States without any certificate of birth, was yesterday in England the capitalized blood of children. As the national debt finds its support in the public revenue, which must cover the yearly payments for interest, etc., the modern system of taxation was the necessary complement of the system of national loans. The loans enabled the government to meet extraordinary expenses without the taxpayers feeling it immediately, but they necessitate as a consequence increased taxes. On the other hand, the raising of taxation caused by the accumulation of debts contracted one after another compels the government always to have recourse to new loans for new extraordinary expenses. Modern fiscality, whose pivot is formed by taxes on the most necessary means of subsistence, thereby increasing their price, thus contains within itself the germ of automatic progression. Overtaxation is not an incident, but rather a principle. In Holland, therefore, where this system was first inaugurated, the great patriot De Witt has, in his Maxims, extolled it as the best system for making the wage laborer submissive, frugal, industrious, and overburdened with labor. The destructive influence that it exercises on the condition of the wage laborer concerns us less, however, here than the forcible expropriation resulting from it of peasants, artisans, and, in a word, all elements of the lower middle class. On this there are not two opinions, even among the bourgeois economists. Its expropriating efficacy is still further heightened by the system of production, which forms one of its integral parts. The great part that the public debt, and the fiscal system corresponding with it, has played in the capitalization of wealth and the expropriation of the masses, has led many writers like Cobbett, Doubleday, and others to seek in this incorrectly the fundamental cause of the misery of the modern peoples. The system of production was an artificial means of manufacturing manufacturers, of expropriating independent laborers, of capitalizing the national means of production and subsistence, of forcibly abbreviating the transition from the medieval to the modern mode of production. The European states tore one another to pieces about the patent of this invention, and, once entered into the service of the surplus value makers, did not merely lay under contribution in the pursuit of this purpose their own people, indirectly through protective duties, directly through export premiums. They also forcibly rooted out, in their dependent countries, all industry, as, for example, England did with the Irish woolen manufacture. On the continent of Europe, after Colbert's example, the process was much simplified. The primitive industrial capital here came in part directly out of the state treasury. Why, cries Mirabeau, why go so far to seek the cause of the manufacturing glory of Saxony before the war? 180 million of debts contracted by the sovereigns, unquote. Colonial system, public debts, heavy taxes, protection, commercial wars, etc. These children of the true manufacturing period increased gigantically during the infancy of modern industry. The birth of the latter is heralded by a great slaughter of the innocents. Like the Royal Navy, the factories were recruited by means of the press gang. Blasé as Sir F.M. Eden is to the horrors of the expropriation of the agricultural population from the soil from the last third of the 15th century to his own time, with all the self-satisfaction with which he rejoices in this process, quote, essential for establishing capitalist agriculture and, quote, the due proportion between arable and pasture land, he does not show, however, the same economic insight in respect to the necessity of child stealing and child slavery for the transformation of manufacturing exploitation into factory exploitation, and the establishment of the, quote, true relation between capital and labor power. He says, quote, it may perhaps be worthy the attention of the public to consider whether any manufacture which, in order to be carried on successfully, requires that cottages and workhouses should be ransacked for poor children, that they should be employed by turns during the greater part of the night, and robbed of that rest which, though indispensable to all, is most required by the young, and that numbers of both sexes, of different ages and dispositions, should be collected together in such a manner that the contagion of example cannot but lead to profligacy and debauchery, will add to the sum of individual or national felicity. Unquote. In the counties of Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and more particularly in Lancashire, says Fielden, quote, the newly invented machinery was used in large factories built on the sides of streams capable of turning the water wheel. Thousands of hands were suddenly required in these places, remote from towns, and Lancashire in particular, being till then comparatively thinly populated and barren, a population was all that she now wanted. The small and nimble fingers of little children being by very far the most in request, the custom instantly sprang up of procuring apprentices from the different parish workhouses of London, Birmingham, and elsewhere. Many, many thousands of these little hapless creatures were sent down into the north, being from the age of 7 to the age of 13 or 14 years old. The custom was for the master to clothe his apprentices and to feed and lodge them in a, quote, apprentice house near the factory. Overseers were appointed to see to the works whose interest it was to work the children to the utmost, because their pay was in proportion to the quantity of work that they could exact. Cruelty was, of course, the consequence. In many of the manufacturing districts, but particularly, I'm afraid, in the guilty county to which I belong, Lancashire, cruelties the most heart-rending were practiced upon the unoffending and friendless creatures who were thus consigned to the charge of master manufacturers. They were harassed to the brink of death by excess of labor, were flogged, fettered, and tortured in the most exquisite refinement of cruelty. They were in many cases starved to the bone while flogged to their work, and even in some instances were driven to commit suicide. The beautiful and romantic valleys of Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and Lancashire, secluded from the public eye, became the dismal solitudes of torture and of many a murder. The profits of manufacturers were enormous, but this only whetted the appetite that it should have satisfied, and therefore the manufacturers had recourse to an expedient that seemed to secure to them those profits without any possibility of limit. They began the practice of what is termed night working. That is, having tired one set of hands by working them throughout the day, they had another set ready to go on working throughout the night, the day set getting into the beds that the night set had just quitted, and in their turn again the night set getting into the beds that the day set quitted in the morning. It is a common tradition in Lancashire that the beds never get cold." Unquote. Footnote: on the earlier infamies of the factory system, see Dr. Aiken, 1795, and Gisborne, Enquiry into the Duties of Men, 1795, Volume 2. When the steam engine transplanted the factories from the country waterfalls to the middle of towns, the, quote, abstemious surplus value maker found the child material ready to his hand, without being forced to seek slaves from the workhouses. When Sir R. Peel, father of the Minister of Plausibility, brought in his bill for the protection of children in 1815, Francis Homer, lumen of the Billion Committee and intimate friend of Ricardo, said in the House of Commons, quote, "It is notorious that with a bankrupt's effects, a gang, if he might use the word, of these children had been put up to sale, and were advertised publicly as part of the property. A most atrocious instance had been brought before the Court of King's Bench 2 years before, in which a number of these boys, apprenticed by a parish in London to one manufacturer, had been transferred to another, and had been found by some benevolent persons in a state of absolute famine. Another case more horrible had come to his knowledge while on a parliamentary committee, that not many years ago an agreement had been made between a London parish and a Lancashire manufacturer, by which it was stipulated that with every 20 sound children, 1 idiot should be taken." Unquote. Back to the main text. With the development of capitalist production during the manufacturing period, the public opinion of Europe had lost the last remnant of shame and conscience. The nations bragged cynically of every infamy that served them as a means to capitalistic accumulation. Read, for example, the naive Annals of Commerce of the worthy A. Anderson. Here it is trumpeted forth as a triumph of English statecraft that, at the Peace of Utrecht, England extorted from the Spaniards by the Asiento Treaty the privilege of being allowed to ply the Negro trade, until then only carried on between Africa and the English West Indies, between Africa and Spanish America as well. England thereby acquired the right of supplying Spanish America until 1743 with 4,800 Negroes yearly. This threw at the same time an official cloak over British smuggling. Liverpool waxed fat on the slave trade. This was its method of primitive accumulation. And even to the present day, Liverpool respectability is the Pindar of the slave trade, which, compare the work of Aiken, 1795, already quoted, quote, has coincided with that spirit of bold adventure which has characterized the trade of Liverpool and rapidly carried it to its present state of prosperity, has occasioned vast employment for shipping and sailors, and greatly augmented the demand for the manufactures of the country. Unquote. Liverpool employed in the slave trade in 1730 15 ships, in 1751 53, in 1760 74, in 1770 96, and in 1792 132. Footnote: in 1790 there were in the English West Indies 10 slaves for 1 free man, in the French 14 for 1, in the Dutch 23 for 1. See Henry Brahms, An Inquiry into the Colonial Policy of the European Powers, Edinburgh, 1803, Volume 2. Back to the main text. Whilst the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, it gave in the United States a stimulus to the transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed, for its pedestal, slavery pure and simple in the New World. Such was the massive effort required to establish the quote-unquote eternal laws of nature, of the capitalist mode of production, to complete the process of separation between laborers and conditions of labor, to transform at one pole the social means of production and subsistence into capital, at the opposite pole, the mass of the population into wage laborers, into quote-unquote free laboring poor, that artificial product of modern society. Footnote, the phrase laboring poor is found in English legislation from the moment when the class of wage laborers becomes noticeable. This term is used in opposition on the one hand to the idle poor, beggars, etc., on the other to those laborers who, pigeons not yet plucked, are still possessors of their own means of labor. From the statute book it passed into political economy and was handed down by Culpeper, J. Child, etc., to Adam Smith and Eden. After this, one can judge of the good faith of the execrable political cantmonger Edmund Burke when he called the expression laboring poor, quote, execrable political cant, unquote. This sycophant, who, in the pay of the English oligarchy, played the romantic praiser of times past against the French Revolution, just as, in the pay of the North American colonies at the beginning of the American Troubles, he had played the liberal against the English oligarchy, was an out-and-out vulgar bourgeois. Quote, the laws of commerce are the laws of nature, and therefore the laws of God, unquote. No wonder that, true to the laws of God and of nature, he always sold himself in the best market. A very good portrait of this Edmund Burke during his liberal time is to be found in the writings of the Reverend Mr. Tucker. Tucker was a parson and a Tory, but for the rest an honorable man and a competent political economist. In face of the infamous cowardice of character that reigns today, and believes most devoutly in the so-called laws of commerce, it is our bounden duty again and again to brand the Burkes, who only differ from their successors in one thing: talent. Back to the main text. If money, according to Marie Augier in Of Public Credit, Paris 1842, quote, comes into the world with a congenital bloodstain on one cheek, unquote, capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. That's the end of the main text, and then there's a closing footnote quoting T.J. Dunning. Capital is said by a quarterly reviewer to fly turbulence and strife, and to be timid, which is very true, but this is very incompletely stating the question. Capital eschews no profit, or a very small profit, just as nature was formerly said to abhor a vacuum. With adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure its employment anywhere. 20% certain will produce eagerness. 50% positive audacity. 100% will make it ready to trample on all human laws. 300% and there's not a crime at which it'll scruple, nor a risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. If turbulence and strife will bring a profit, it will freely encourage both. Smuggling and the slave trade have amply proved all that is here stated, unquote. And that is the end of Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 31. What did you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and as we don't run ads on this channel and it's purely viewer supported, they allow me to spend a lot more time on it than I'd be able to do otherwise. So if you like this channel and want to see more from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here and apply it to your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 32, Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation, from Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 32 is the second to last chapter in Capital Volume 1. and it's part of Part 8 of 8, Primitive Accumulation, which deals with how capitalism arose out of feudalism. The previous chapter talked about colonialism and the acquisition of wealth, basically just by theft and slavery, and the previous chapters talked about some of the internal transformations of countries like England, which Marx considers the classical example of a country turning from feudalism to capitalism. And in this very brief chapter, Marx is going to wrap it all up, talking about some of the final hurdles that the capitalists face in setting up their system to run basically for as long as they can get it to run. So we get a short summary here of how the capitalists transform private property into specifically capitalist private property or bourgeois property with the socialization of the labor process. Let's begin. What does the primitive accumulation of capital, i.e. its historical genesis, resolve itself into? Insofar as it's not immediate transformation of slaves and serfs into wage laborers, and therefore a mere change of form, it only means the expropriation of the immediate producers, i.e. the dissolution of private property based on the labor of its owner. Private property, as the antithesis to social collective property, exists only where the means of labor and the external conditions of labor belong to private individuals. But according as these private individuals are laborers or not laborers, private property has a different character. The numberless shades that it at first sight presents correspond to the intermediate stages lying between these two extremes. The private property of the laborer in their means of production is the foundation of petty industry, whether agricultural, manufacturing, or both. Petty industry, again, is an essential condition for the development of social production and of the free individuality of the laborer themselves. Of course, this petty mode of production exists also under slavery, serfdom, and other states of dependence, but it flourishes. It lets loose its whole energy. It attains its adequate classical form only where the laborer is the private owner of their own means of labor set in action by themselves, the peasant of the land which they cultivate, the artisan of the tool which they handle as a virtuoso. This mode of production presupposes parceling of the soil and scattering of the other means of production. As it excludes the concentration of these means of production, so also it excludes cooperation, division of labor within each separate process of production, the control over and the productive application of the forces of nature by society, and the free development of the social productive powers. It is compatible only with a system of production and a society moving within narrow and more or less primitive bounds. To perpetuate it would be, as Pecker rightly says, quote, to decree universal mediocrity, unquote. At a certain stage of development, it brings forth the material agencies for its own dissolution. From that moment, new forces and new passions spring up in the bosom of society. But the old social organization fetters them and keeps them down. It must be annihilated. It is annihilated. Its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production into socially concentrated ones, of the pygmy property of the many into the huge property of the few, the expropriation of the great mass of the people from the soil, from the means of subsistence, and from the means of labor. This fearful and painful expropriation of the mass of the people forms the prelude to the history of capital. It comprises a series of forcible methods of which we have passed in review only those that have been epoch-making as measures of the primitive accumulation of capital. The expropriation of the immediate producers was accomplished with merciless vandalism, and under the stimulus of passions the most infamous, the most sordid, the pettiest, the most meanly odious. Self-earned private property, that is based, so to say, on the fusing together of the isolated, independent laboring individual with the conditions of their labor, is supplanted by capitalistic private property, which rests on exploitation of the nominally free labor of others, i.e. on wage labor. Footnote quoting Sismondi, we are in a situation which is entirely new for society. We are striving to separate every kind of property from every kind of labor, unquote. Back to the main text. As soon as this process of transformation has sufficiently decomposed the old society from top to bottom, as soon as the laborers are turned into proletarians, their means of labor into capital, as soon as the capitalist mode of production stands on its own feet, then the further socialization of labor and further transformation of the land and other means of production into socially exploited, and therefore common means of production, as well as the further expropriation of private proprietors takes a new form. That which is now to be expropriated is no longer the laborer working for themselves, but the capitalist exploiting many laborers. This expropriation is accomplished by the action of the immanent laws of capitalistic production itself, by the centralization of capital. One capitalist always kills many. Hand in hand with the centralization, or this expropriation of many capitalists by few, develop, On an ever-extending scale, the cooperative form of the labor process, the conscious technical application of science, the methodical cultivation of the soil, the transformation of the instruments of labor into instruments of labor only usable in common, the economizing of all means of production by their use as means of production of combined, socialized labor, the entanglement of all peoples in the net of the world market, and with this, the international character of the capitalistic regime, along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital, who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with and under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. The capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of the proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a law of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of negation. This does not re-establish private property for the producer, but gives them individual property based on the acquisition of the capitalist era, i.e. on cooperation and the possession in common of the land and of the means of production. The transformation of scattered private property arising from individual labor into capitalist private property is naturally a process incomparably more protracted, violent, and difficult than the transformation of capitalistic private property, already practically resting on socialized production, into socialized property. In the former case, we had the expropriation of the mass of the people by a few usurpers. In the latter, we have the expropriation of a few usurpers by the mass of the people. And a footnote, the advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes perish and disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle classes, the small manufacturers, the shopkeepers, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. And this, of course, is a quote from Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party. And that's the end of Chapter 32. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So if you like this channel and want to see more from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life. So make sure to take what you've learned here and apply it in your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 33, The Modern Theory of Colonization, from Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon, or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall, or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this is a special moment because Chapter 33 is the final chapter in Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1, so for those who have been following along with these recordings as they've been posted this year, I know there's several hundred of you. Congratulations for making it to the end, but really if you're listening to this at any time, congratulations on making it to the end. We're going to assume at this point that you've listened to the rest. We are planning to do additional volumes of Capital, probably at a rate of 1 volume per year, in order to leave room for other things to be read and discussed and other videos to be made. But seriously, if you've made it this far, if you've read all of the preceding chapters, congratulations. This is a very challenging work, not just in terms of the language, which is difficult, at least in places, and if you think that it's difficult just listening to it, try reading it out loud and anticipating where the emphasis is going to be. Marx does a lot of very lengthy sentences, and sometimes it's a real guessing game as to which word to emphasize over another when you're reading it. Anyway, in addition to the linguistic challenges of the work, it's also just kind of brutal. What Capital shows is that the setting up of capitalism, when this emerged, there was so much structural violence, ripping people from the land and from their ability to provide for themselves. It's extremely difficult to just listen to horror after horror, and to know also that this process is still going on in corners of the world today as an active, newly developing, ongoing process. So, some of the theory is a little bit intellectually challenging, some of the language, because it is older and also just written at a very high level, a little bit hard to keep up with here and there, and then just also emotionally. This is really weighty stuff. So again, if you've made it this far, sincere congratulations, welcome comrade to the other side of Capital Volume 1. And I guess with that said, let's just jump into Chapter 33, which is the last chapter in Part 8 of 8, Primitive Accumulation, and the last chapter in the book. And actually, we're going to start with a note that when we're talking about colonization, Marx says, we treat here of real colonies, virgin soils colonized by free immigrants. The United States are, speaking economically, still only a colony of Europe. Besides, to this category belong such old plantations as those in which the abolition of slavery has completely altered the earlier conditions. Let's begin the main text. Political economy confuses on principle two very different kinds of private property, of which one rests on the producer's own labor, the other on the employment of the labor of others. It forgets that the latter not only is the direct antithesis or opposite of the former, but absolutely grows on its tomb only. In Western Europe, the home of political economy, the process of primitive accumulation is more or less accomplished. Here the capitalist regime has either directly conquered the whole domain of national production, or, where economic conditions are less developed, it at least indirectly controls those strata of society which, though belonging to the antiquated or outdated mode of production, continue to exist side by side with it in gradual decay. To this ready-made world of capital, the political economist applies the notions of law and of property inherited from a pre-capitalistic world with all the more anxious zeal and all the greater unction, the more loudly the facts cry out in the face of their ideology. It is otherwise, though, in the colonies. There, the capitalist regime everywhere comes into collision with the resistance of the producer, who, as owner of their own conditions of labor, employs that labor to enrich themselves instead of the capitalist. The contradiction of these two diametrically opposed economic systems manifests itself here practically in a struggle between them. Where the capitalist has at their back the power of the mother country, they try to clear out of their way by force the modes of production and appropriation based on the independent labor of the producer. The same interest which compels the sycophant of capital, the political economist, in the mother country, to proclaim the theoretical identity of the capitalist mode of production with its contrary, that same interest compels them in the colonies to make a clean breast of it, and to proclaim aloud the antagonism of the two modes of production. To this end, they prove how the development of the social productive power of labor, cooperation, division of labor, use of machinery on a large scale, etc., are impossible without the expropriation of the laborers, and the corresponding transformation of their means of production into capital. In the interest of the so-called national wealth, they seek for artificial means to ensure the poverty of the people. Here their apologetic armor crumbles off, bit by bit, like rotten touchwood. It is the great merit of E.G. Wakefield to have discovered, not anything new about the colonies, but to have discovered in the colonies the truth as to the conditions of capitalist production in the mother country. Footnote, Wakefield's few glimpses on the subject of modern colonization are fully anticipated by Mirabeau Père, the physiocrat, and even much earlier by English economists. Back to the main text. As the system of production at its origin attempted to manufacture capitalists artificially in the mother country, so Wakefield's colonization theory, which England tried for a time to enforce by acts of parliament, attempted to effect the manufacture of wage workers in the colonies. This he calls systematic colonization. Footnote. Later, it became a temporary necessity in the international competitive struggle. That's referring to the system of protection at its origin. But whatever its motive, the consequences remain the same. Back to the main text. First of all, Wakefield discovered that in the colonies, property and money, means of subsistence, machines, and other means of production, does not as yet stamp a person as a capitalist if there be wanting the correlative, the wage worker, the other person who is compelled to sell themselves of their own free will. He discovered that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons, established by the instrumentality of things. Footnote quoting Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, a Negro is a Negro. In certain circumstances, he becomes a slave. A mule is a machine for spinning cotton. Only under certain circumstances does it become capital. Outside these circumstances, it is no more capital than gold is intrinsically money, or sugar is the price of sugar. Capital is a social relation of production. It is a historical relation of production. Unquote, back to the main text. Mr. Peel, he moans, took with him from England to Swan River, West Australia, means of subsistence and of production to the amount of £50,000. Mr. Peel had the foresight to bring with him besides 300 persons of the working class, men, women, and children. Once arrived at his destination, quote, Mr. Peel was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. That's quoting from Wakefield's England and America, Volume 2. Unhappy Mr. Peel, who provided for everything except the export of English modes of production to Swan River. For the understanding of the following discoveries of Wakefield, 2 preliminary remarks. We know that the means of production and subsistence, while they remain the property of the immediate producer, are not capital. They become capital only under circumstances in which they serve at the same time as means of exploitation and subjection of the laborer. But this capitalist soul of theirs is so intimately wedded, in the head of the political economist, to their material substance, that he christens them capital under all circumstances, even when they are its exact opposite. Thus it is with Wakefield. Further, the splitting up of the means of production into the individual property of many independent laborers, working on their own account, he calls equal division of capital. It is with the political economist as with the feudal jurist. The latter stuck on to pure monetary relations the labels supplied by feudal law. If, says Wakefield, quote, all members of the society are supposed to possess equal portions of capital, no man would have a motive for accumulating more capital than he could use with his own hands. This is to some extent the case in new American settlements, where a passion for owning land prevents the existence of a class of laborers for hire. And that's quoting Wakefield's England and America again, as are the next few quotes. Marx continues, so long, therefore, as the laborer can accumulate for himself, and this he can do so long as he remains possessor of his means of production, capitalist accumulation and the capitalistic mode of production are impossible. The class of wage laborers, essential to these, is wanting. How then, in old Europe, was the expropriation of the laborer from their conditions of labor, i.e., the coexistence of capital and wage labor, brought about? By a social contract of a quite original kind. Quote, mankind have adopted a simple contrivance for promoting the accumulation of capital, unquote, which of course, since the time of Adam, floated in their imagination as the sole and final end of their existence. Quote, they have divided themselves into owners of capital and owners of labor. The division was the result of concert and combination, unquote. In one word, the mass of mankind expropriated itself in honor of the, quote, accumulation of capital. Now, one would think that this instinct of self-denying fanaticism would give itself full fling, especially in the colonies, where alone exist the men and conditions that could turn a social contract from a dream to a reality. Why then should quote-unquote systematic colonization be called in to replace its opposite, spontaneous, unregulated colonization? But, quote, in the northern states of the American Union, it may be doubted whether so many as 1/10 of the people would fall under the description of hired laborers. In England, the laboring class composed the bulk of the people, unquote. Nay, the impulse to self-expropriation on the part of laboring humanity for the glory of capital exists so little that slavery, according to Wakefield himself, is the sole natural basis of colonial wealth. His systematic colonization is a mere stopgap, since he unfortunately has to do with free men, not with slaves. Quote, the first Spanish settlers in St. Domingo did not obtain laborers from Spain, but without laborers their capital must have perished, or at least must soon have been diminished to that small amount which each individual could employ with their own hands. This has actually occurred in the last colony founded by England, the Swan River settlement, where a great mass of capital, of seeds, implements, and cattle has perished for want of laborers to use it, and where no settler has preserved much more capital than they can employ with their own hands." Unquote. We have seen that the expropriation of the mass of the people from the soil forms the basis of the capitalist mode of production. The essence of a free colony, on the contrary, consists in this, that the bulk of the soil is still public property, and every settler on it therefore can turn part of it into their private property and individual means of production, without hindering the later settlers in the same operation. Quoting Wakefield, "Land, to be an element of colonization, must not only be waste, but it must be public property, liable to be converted into private property." Unquote. This is the secret both of the prosperity of the colonies and of their inveterate vice, opposition to the establishment of capital. Quote, "Where land is very cheap and all men are free, where everyone who so pleases can easily obtain a piece of land for themselves, not only is labor very dear, as respects the laborer's share of the produce, but the difficulty is to obtain combined labor at any price." Unquote. As in the colonies, the separation of the laborer from the conditions of labor and their root the soil does not exist, or only sporadically, or on too limited a scale, so neither does the separation of agriculture from industry exist, nor the destruction of the household industry of the peasantry. Whence then is to come the internal market for capital? Quote, "No part of the population of America is exclusively agricultural, excepting slaves and their employers who combine capital and labor in particular works. Free Americans who cultivate the soil follow many other occupations. Some portion of the furniture and tools which they use is commonly made by themselves. They frequently build their own houses and carry to market at whatever distance the produce of their own industry. They are spinners and weavers. They make soap and candles, as well as, in many cases, shoes and clothes for their own use. In America, the cultivation of land is often the secondary pursuit of a blacksmith, a miller, or a shopkeeper." Unquote. With such queer people as these, where is the field of abstinence for the capitalists? The great beauty of capitalist production consists in this, that it not only constantly reproduces the wage worker as wage worker, but produces always, in proportion to the accumulation of capital, a relative surplus population of wage workers. Thus the law of supply and demand of labor is kept in the right rut. The oscillation of wages is penned within limits satisfactory to capitalist exploitation, and lastly, the social dependence of the laborer on the capitalist, that indispensable requisite, is secured. An unmistakable relation of dependence, which the smug political economist at home in the mother country can transmogrify into one of free contract between buyer and seller, between equally independent owners of commodities, the owner of the commodity capital and the owner of the commodity labor. But in the colonies, this pretty fancy is torn asunder. The absolute population here increases much more quickly than in the mother country, because many laborers enter this world as ready-made adults, and yet the labor market is always understocked. The law of supply and demand of labor falls to pieces. On the one hand, the old world constantly throws in capital, thirsting after exploitation and abstinence. On the other, the regular reproduction of the wage laborer as wage laborer comes into collision with impediments the most impertinent and in part invincible. What becomes of the production of wage laborers, supernumerary in proportion to the accumulation of capital? The wage worker of today is tomorrow an independent peasant or artisan working for themselves. They vanish from the labor market, but not into the workhouse. This constant transformation of the wage laborers into independent producers who work for themselves instead of for capital, and enrich themselves instead of the capitalist gentry, reacts in its turn very perversely on the conditions of the labor market. Not only does the degree of exploitation of the wage laborer remain indecently low, the wage laborer loses into the bargain, along with the relation of dependence, also the sentiment of dependence on the abstemious capitalist. Hence all the inconveniences that our E.G. Wakefield pictures so doughtily, so eloquently, so pathetically. The supply of wage labor, he complains, is neither constant, nor regular, nor sufficient. Quote, "The supply of labor is always not only small, but uncertain." Quote, "Though the produce divided between the capitalist and the laborer be large, the laborer takes so great a share that he soon becomes a capitalist. Few, even those whose lives are unusually long, can accumulate great masses of wealth." Unquote. The laborers most distinctly decline to allow the capitalist to abstain from the payment of the greater part of their labor. And it avails him nothing if he's so cunning as to import from Europe, with his own capital, his own wage workers. They soon, quote, "cease to be laborers for hire. They become independent landowners, if not competitors with their former masters in the labor market." Unquote. Think of the horror. The excellent capitalist has imported bodily from Europe, with their own good money, their own competitors. The end of the world has come. No wonder Wakefield laments the absence of all dependence and of all sentiment of dependence on the part of the wage workers in the colonies. On account of the high wages, says his disciple Merivale, there is in the colonies, quote, the urgent desire for cheaper and more subservient laborers, for a class to whom the capitalist might dictate terms instead of being dictated to by them. In ancient civilized countries, the laborer, though free, is by law of nature dependent on capitalists. In colonies, this dependence must be created by artificial means, unquote. And there's a footnote. Even the mild free trade vulgar economist Molinari says, quote, in the colonies where slavery has been abolished without the compulsory labor being replaced with an equivalent quantity of free labor, there has occurred the opposite of what happens every day before our eyes. Simple workers have been seen to exploit in their turn the industrial entrepreneurs, demanding from them wages which bear absolutely no relation to the legitimate share in the product which they ought to receive. You can almost see him pounding his fist on the table. The outrage. The planters were unable to obtain for their sugar a sufficient price to cover the increase in wages, and were obliged to furnish the extra amount at first out of their profits and then out of their very capital. A considerable amount of planters have been ruined as a result, while others have closed down their businesses in order to avoid the ruin which threatened them. It is doubtless better that these accumulations of capital should be destroyed than that generations of men should perish, but would it not be better if both survived? Unquote. Marx adds, Mr. Molinari, what then becomes of the 10 Commandments, of Moses and the prophets, of the law of supply and demand if in Europe the, quote, entrepreneur can cut down the laborer's legitimate part, and in the West Indies the laborer can cut down the entrepreneur's? And what, if you please, is this legitimate part, which on your own showing the capitalist in Europe daily neglects to pay? Over yonder, in the colonies where the laborers are so, quote, simple as to, quote, exploit the capitalist, Mr. Molinari feels a strong itching to set the law of supply and demand that works elsewhere automatically on the right road by means of the police. Back to the main text. What is now, according to Wakefield, the consequence of this unfortunate state of things in the colonies? A, quote, barbarizing tendency of dispersion, unquote, of producers and national wealth. The parceling out of the means of production among innumerable owners working on their own account annihilates, along with the centralization of capital, all the foundation of combined labor. Every long-winded undertaking, extending over several years and demanding outlay of fixed capital, is prevented from being carried out. In Europe, capital invests without hesitating a moment, for the working class constitutes its living appurtenance, always in excess, always at disposal. But, in the colonies, Wakefield tells an extremely doleful anecdote. He was talking with some capitalists of Canada and the state of New York, where the immigrant wave often becomes stagnant and deposits a sediment of supernumerary laborers. Our capital, says one of the characters in the melodrama, quote, was ready for many operations which require a considerable period of time for their completion, but we could not begin such operations with labor which, we knew, would soon leave us. If we had been sure of retaining the labor of such emigrants, we should have been glad to have engaged it at once and for a high price. And we should have engaged it, even though we had been sure it would leave us, provided we had been sure of a fresh supply whenever we might need it, unquote. After Wakefield has constructed the English capitalist agriculture and its, quote, combined labor with the scattered cultivation of American peasants, he unwittingly gives us a glimpse at the reverse of the medal, the other side of the coin. He depicts the mass of the American people as well-to-do, independent, enterprising, and comparatively cultured, whilst, quote, the English agricultural laborer is a miserable wretch, a pauper. In what country except North America and some new colonies do the wages of free labor employed in agriculture much exceed a bare subsistence for the laborer? Undoubtedly, farm horses in England, being a valuable property, are better fed than English peasants, unquote. But, never mind, national wealth is, once again, by its very nature, identical with misery of the people. How then to heal the anti-capitalistic cancer of the colonies? If men were willing, at a blow, to turn all the soil from public into private property, they would destroy certainly the root of the evil, but also the colonies. The trick is how to kill two birds with one stone. Let the government put upon the virgin soil an artificial price, independent of the law of supply and demand, a price that compels the immigrant to work a long time for wages before he can earn enough money to buy land, and turn himself into an independent peasant. Footnote quoting Colin, it is, you add, a result of the appropriation of the soil and of capital that the man who has nothing but the strength of his arms finds employment and creates an income for himself. but the opposite is true. It is thanks to the individual appropriation of the soil that there exist men who only possess the strength of their arms. When you put a man in a vacuum, you rob him of the air. You do the same when you take away the soil from him, for you're putting him in a space void of wealth, so as to leave him no way of living except according to your wishes." Unquote. Back to the main text. The fund resulting from the sale of land at a price relatively prohibitory for the wage workers, this fund of money extorted from the wages of labor by violation of the sacred law of supply and demand, the government is to employ, on the other hand, in proportion as it grows, to import have-nothings from Europe into the colonies, and thus keep the wage labor market full for the capitalists. Under these circumstances, everything will be for the better in the best of all possible worlds. This is the great secret of, quote, systematic colonization. By this plan, Wakefield cries in triumph, quote, "The supply of labor must be constant and regular, because first, as no laborer would be able to procure land until he had worked for money, all immigrant laborers working for a time for wages and in combination would produce capital for the employment of more laborers. Secondly, because every laborer who left off working for wages and became a landowner would, by purchasing land, provide a fund for bringing fresh labor to the colony." Unquote. The price of the soil imposed by the state must of course be a, quote, sufficient price, i.e. so high, quote, as to prevent the laborers from becoming independent landowners until others had followed to take their place, unquote. This sufficient price for the land is nothing but a euphemistic circumlocution for the ransom which the laborer pays to the capitalist for leave to retire from the wage labor market to the land. First, he must create for the capitalist capital, with which the latter may be able to exploit more laborers. Then he must place at his own expense a placeholder on the labor market, whom the government forwards across the sea for the benefit of his old master, the capitalist. It is very characteristic that the English government for years practiced this method of primitive accumulation prescribed by Mr. Wakefield expressly for the use of the colonies. The fiasco was, of course, as complete as that of Sir Robert Peel's Bank Act. The stream of emigration was only diverted from the English colonies to the United States. Meanwhile, the advance of capitalistic production in Europe, accompanied by increasing government pressure, has rendered Wakefield's recipe superfluous. On the one hand, the enormous and ceaseless stream of men, year after year driven upon America, leaves behind a stationary sediment in the east of the United States, the wave of immigration from Europe throwing men on the labor market there more rapidly than the wave of emigration westwards can wash them away. On the other hand, the American Civil War brought in its train a colossal national debt, and with it pressure of taxes, the rise of the vilest financial aristocracy, the squandering of a huge part of the public land on speculative companies for the exploitation of railways, mines, etc. In brief, the most rapid centralization of capital. The Great Republic has therefore ceased to be the promised land for emigrant laborers. Capitalistic production advances there with giant strides, even though the lowering of wages and the dependence of the wage worker are yet far from being brought down to the normal European level. The shameless lavishing of uncultivated colonial land on aristocrats and capitalists by the government, so loudly denounced even by Wakefield, has produced, especially in Australia, in conjunction with the stream of men that the gold diggings attract, and with the competition that the importation of English commodities causes even to the smallest artisan, an ample relative surplus laboring population, so that almost every mail brings the Job's news of a, quote, glut of the Australia labor market, and the prostitution in some places flourishes as wantonly as in the London Haymarket. Footnote, as soon as Australia became her own lawgiver, she passed, of course, laws favorable to the settlers, but the squandering of the land, already accomplished by the English government, stands in the way. Quoting the Land Law of Victoria by the Honourable C.G. Duffy, Minister of Public Lands, London, 1862, the first and main object at which the new Land Act of 1862 aims is to give increased facilities for the settlement of the people, unquote. Back to the main text. However, we are not concerned here with the conditions of the colonies. The only thing that interests us is the secret discovered in the New World by the political economy of the Old World, and proclaimed on the housetops, that the capitalist mode of production and accumulation, and therefore capitalist private property, have for their fundamental condition the annihilation of self-earned private property. In other words, the expropriation of the laborer. And that is the end of Chapter 33 of Part 8 of 8, and of Capital Volume 1 generally. Again, I congratulate you if you started at the beginning and made it all the way through to the end here. And if you haven't, I encourage you to do that. You will learn so much in the process about capitalism, where it came from, how it works, where it's headed, providing really vital and often missing context to our world today. So, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can make a one-time or a recurring donation. Every contribution is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time working on this channel than I would be able to do without them. So if you like this channel, have learned something from it, want to see more from it in the future, and to help it help other people to learn what you've learned, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here and apply it to your real-world political organizing. Next up on the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide is Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, so look for that coming soon. And in the meantime, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next video.